We'll go ahead and get started. I think that Stanley asked also if you would mute your mic if you're not speaking. That would be great, because for me, my dog could start barking at any moment, and we appreciate that you are muted. I'm Mary Murray, one of the co-facilitators for the P20 Literacy Collaborative. And Dottie, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. I'm Dottie Erb, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Literacy Collaborative. And welcome, everyone.
We're so happy to have you here. Instead of going through and doing introductions, because that could take our speaker's entire time, if this is your first P20 Literacy Collaborative, could you unmute yourself and just introduce yourself to us? Because we're so happy to have new members here with us as well. So we'll give you 1 minute to unmute yourself and introduce yourself. I know at least one person who's new and it's their first meeting.
Hi, my name is Mary Dawes, and I'm from the Ohio Department of Education, and I sit very close to the popular Earl.
Thank you, Mary. Anyone else?
Hi, I'm Allison Lauman. I teach at Washington, 3rd grade, Marietta.
Wonderful, thank you.
Hi, I'm Maria Pappas, Chief of Core Curriculum in the Youngstown City Schools.
Welcome.
Bonnie Stalter, Marietta, Ohio, Washington Elementary, 1st grade.
Welcome.
Good morning. I'm Kim Christensen, and I coordinate the Inclusive Early Childhood Program at Bowling Green State University.
Welcome, Kim.
I'm Robin Hott. I teach Title I in Marietta City Schools at Washington Elementary.
Great. Anyone else? We are so excited to have new IHE and PK-12 teachers and administrators with us today as well. And again, welcome to all of you, but welcome to our new members of welcome to the new people who are here. We're happy to have all of you with us today as well. So without further ado, Dottie is going to introduce our distinguished speaker today, and we'll be back with you when we have break. Our schedule is such that we go until 11:45, have a break till 12:30, so you'll have 45 minutes to re-nourish, and then we get back and have presentation, the second half of it, till 1:30, and we adjourn at 2 o'clock. So get ready, get comfortable, and Dottie will do a phenomenal introduction of our speaker.
It's my pleasure to virtually welcome Stephen Dykstra to Ohio. We wish that we could see you in person, but we're settling on a virtual meeting today. Dr. Dykstra has worked in public sector community mental health for more than 25 years. He is a founding member of the Wisconsin Reading Coalition and vice president of the Coalition for Reading Excellence. Through the course of his work and life, he has come to see the role of reading, reading struggles, and reading failure in the lives of thousands of children he has served, as well as in their families, schools, and communities. He tries to bring together the science of reading he has discovered with the lessons he has learned from the children he serves and what he knows about people to understand how we got to where we are and how we might change that. Welcome, Dr. Dykstra.
Thank you very much. So what we're going to talk about today, what I've obviously from the title that you see in front of you, a developmental mental model of trauma, growth, and resilience, the place for language and reading. I'm not going to talk to, it's going to be infused in there. There's going to be moments that it comes up, things that I mentioned, both from the slides and extra bits of material that I add. We'll talk a little bit about how the best ways to teach reading, but I should be very upfront with everybody. I am not a reading teacher. While I am a devoted student of reading science and have been for about 15 years, once I renewed that interest, which I originally had in graduate school, I don't pretend to be a reading teacher. I don't have the courage or the skills or the toolbox to stand in front of a classroom of 25 first graders and try to teach them to read. I do know something about what works. I know a lot about what doesn't work. I know a lot, I think, about how we've gotten to where we are and why we've made some of the mistakes we've made. Those mistakes are not uncommon. Most professional fields go through things like this where they struggle with the essential nature of what they do, and they have a period of time where they struggle with one or more issues. And sometimes those struggles last a very long time. From the time that astronomers proved definitively using math that the sun was at the center of the solar system, that it wasn't the Earth, it was well over 200 years before all major universities in the world bought into that and taught that. I hope it's not 200 years before we embrace the science of reading. I don't think it will be. Things move faster now, thank God. A little bit more about my background. As the introduction said, I'm a psychologist. I work in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My main gig during the day is, on a typical day, has to do with severe mental health concerns of children, a lot of crisis work. I've worked directly with several thousand children in the course of my life. One of the things I've learned to do is to ask a question, and this question will come up later. To ask children a question when I'm first assessing and evaluating them and trying to figure out where their difficulties originated. And the question I've learned to ask is, tell me about when you first started in school. Kindergarten, first grade, second grade. Did anything go better or worse than everything else? Was there something that was harder? Maybe you got in trouble more often than other children. Was math harder? And then the one I'm really interested in was reading more difficult. And part of what drove me to ask that question was realizing how many of the children I served were coming to me not because they had a reading difficulty. The people referring their children to me and the way they got to me had no idea that I had an interest in reading and the early teaching of reading to children. But I came to realize that a lot of the children I saw who were disruptive in some way, were identified as being mentally ill in some way. And one of the things that was making it worse for them was that they also struggled to read. And in some cases, their difficulties made it hard to read. In many cases, their difficulty with learning to read made the other things worse. I think that's something we have to realize right now, that this is not a chicken and the egg phenomenon, that children in the early years who struggle to read and have some behavioral difficulties, maybe don't attend school regularly, seem unmotivated, irritable, anxious, attention deficit type symptoms. It's not a question of, do those conditions cause the reading difficulty, or does the reading difficulty contribute to those conditions? The answer, of course, is yes. Whichever question you ask, the answer is yes. The question is, where are we most able to intervene? I am still occasionally frustrated. I don't see this as much as I used to. I still am occasionally frustrated when the response I or parents or other people get from schools is that, well, Johnny will be able to read better when we get his ADHD under control, or Johnny would be able to read better if he wasn't so anxious, or Susie would be able to read better if she was in school more often. All of that may be true. It's also true those things would get better if those children could read better. And I have some stories for you about 4 children in particular that I'm going to tell you that illustrate some of these principles as we go. This is a quote from a song by Dan Fogelberg. If you're old enough, and some of you are hearing the music in your head right now, you're hearing his soft pop voice singing these words. In the passage from the cradle to the grave, we are born madly dancing. In the passage from the cradle to the grave, we are born madly dancing. That's what development is. It is this process of dancing madly between the cradle and the grave. When I talk about child development, when I mention child development, most people, particularly if they have children and they made all those visits to pediatricians with their well children when they were young, they read all the baby books, Most people, when you think of child development, their mind goes right to developmental milestones. And that's appropriate, and developmental milestones are a good thing. But developmental milestones they're a screening test, a probe to check little things to see if maybe we see some obvious concerns with development. But development is not developmental milestones. Child development and human development is so much deeper and so much broader. And I thought this line from the song captured it so well. In the passage from the cradle to the grave, we are born madly dancing. That we are trying always to do the dance that will lead us to the most happiness, that we are trying to develop the skills and acquire the knowledge and the experiences that will help us to dance better tomorrow. That today I will become a better dancer, and tomorrow I will become a better dancer, and eventually I will be able to dance my way through life in a way that's satisfying to me, good for the people around me. Sadly, very sadly, tragically, many of our children struggle to dance, struggle to develop as successfully as they inherently want to develop, and to develop as successfully as we would like them to develop. We may be concerned with the course of their development, and at some point they will also be concerned with the course of their development. And I'll talk a little bit later about when that occurs and why that's such a crisis. And learning to read, being able to read, more than just reading, but a mastery of language, an ability to be good with language, an ability to take in language, to produce language, to use language, is absolutely essential. It is a core element of this developmental dance. Sometimes I refer to it as a developmental machine. I have a note here hanging in front of me to remind me to use that phrase, developmental machine. What I mean by the developmental machine is the combination of genetics, experiences, society, friends, family, community, everything that happens to a child, everything that doesn't happen with a child, the way that interacts with their prior history, the way that interacts with their own genetic traits and features. All of that for each child is a machine moving that child forward, driving that child's development forward. Some of it is inherent, it's built in, it's hormonal signals, it's growth signals, it's the development of the brain that goes on whether we want it to or not, driving this developmental machine forward. But it's also the experiences we have along the way, the experiences that come to us, that people give to us, that we seek out. And very importantly, it is the things which may be missing. Development is driven not just by what happens, but in many cases by what doesn't happen or what's missing. In some cases, the things that happen are bad. In some cases, the things we avoid are a blessing that we avoided them. On the other hand, many of the things we experience are good for us and drive our development very positively. It's also true that some of the things we miss, that children miss out on, would have been treasures in their life and would have been tremendous things in their life. So we have to remember that we're being affected on both hands. Things that happen, things that don't happen, we're being affected for the better and the worse by both of those experiences. All of that, put that simply, explains all of human development. It's enormously complex because we're talking about millions and millions of events in a child's life. Things they hear, things they see, things they don't hear, and things they don't see. Most often, no one event has a profound lasting impact. Most often, it's the accumulation of these millions of events that drive the developmental machine forward. In some cases, and we'll talk some about that, it's specific events. It's specific, unique, outstanding events which mark turning points in a child's life, inflection points where everything before and after, everything after that is different than everything before that. And oftentimes, those are traumas. So I want to start my first story. I want to tell you about a girl from up north. In Wisconsin, up north depends on where you live. If you live in the southern part of the state like I do in Milwaukee, and you've lived there your whole life, up north is anything north of the center of the state. If you live in the center of the state, up north is cities like Rhinelander and Crivitz and Woodruff and Minocqua. And you can all look those up on a map for yourself. But this was a girl from up north. I don't honestly remember what town she was from. I didn't meet her in her home. I don't work where she lives, so I know under normal circumstances, I never would have met her. But I met her one morning in a hospital bed at Children's Hospital of Wisconsin, which is a couple of miles that way. A very fine children's hospital, as you have fine children's hospitals across Ohio. What had happened was the day before, this young lady, she was 17 years old, was struggling in high school, was struggling in a lot of aspects of her life. Had made an attempt on her own life. She had tried to kill herself. And the attempt was so serious that she had to be put in a helicopter and flown to Children's Hospital here in Milwaukee. They could not care for her adequately. They could not assure her survival if she had stayed closer to home. You have to imagine how bad this was, how tragic this was, how traumatic this was to her and her mother and her sister, who was there when I met with them. And the reason I got involved was because the paperwork to make sure that she would get psychiatric care when she was done, that she wouldn't be allowed to walk away, the beginning of an actual commitment process, wasn't done in her small town. The police weren't there yet, so they put her in the helicopter and they flew her here. So it was done by a sheriff's deputy from Milwaukee County. That got Milwaukee County involved, and that got me involved, because this is one of the things I do from Milwaukee County. So that's the circumstance, and you have to imagine that I walk into this hospital room, and there's a girl sitting in a bed, propped up. I would have guessed she was 13 or 14 if I had seen her. She was a tiny little thing, and, you know, kids vary a lot. She was a tiny little thing, and they all look like waifs. When they're sitting there, hooked up to monitors, you know, trays and IV bags and IV pumps hanging all around them. I walked in, I introduced myself and explained why I was there, and I turned to my left, and I could obviously understand this was her mother. She's a very pleasant lady. I think was glad that her daughter was doing better by the next morning. And sitting over by a window on a ledge was her sister, who had come from college during the night to be with her mother and her sister to support them during this time. And I asked them a lot of questions. We talked about a lot of things. And I got around to saying, what happened? Why are you here? And she explained that she had had the overdose, that she had wanted to kill herself, that she was quite serious about it. She took these pills and didn't tell anyone. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about what led up to this. She explained that she was not doing well in school. She explained she didn't live at home with her parents anymore. Her mother and father had had a very nasty divorce a few years earlier, very ugly. She got very disgusted with both of them, and she had moved out. She just took her things and left. It was couch surfing amongst friends. She had a group of close friends, 4, 5, 6 girls, and she would live with one for a couple of weeks, live with another one for a couple of weeks, make her cycle through it, and been doing that for more than a year. Trying to imagine the pain that it would take to have to go through something like that, to put yourself in that situation. But she talked about it like it was nothing. She talked about it smoothly. She wasn't upset. There wasn't a tear in her eye. Her mother talked about it and what went into it without shame or embarrassment. Nobody cried. Nobody felt bad in particular. It was just business as usual. They had dealt with this in a way that they just could talk about it, and it was fairly ordinary for them. Turned out while she was couch surfing, she had become quite vulnerable, as you can imagine, without parents there to keep an eye on her. And she had been violently sexually assaulted twice in the time that she had been living away from her family. That wasn't enough to drive her back home. She still wanted to stay away, but she had been violently sexually assaulted, raped twice, the second time by a young man she knew who was from her high school. She talked about that like it was fairly ordinary, businesslike, no different than I'm talking now. She had learned to understand that and cope with that in a way that allowed her to talk about this with relatively little emotion. Surely it contributed to the reason she was there. The boy who raped her from her high school was a very popular student, an outstanding student, very well known, star athlete on most of the teams. Everybody in town knew him. When he was arrested for sexually assaulting her, she had become an outcast at school. She was bullied. She was chided. She lost some friends. People didn't talk to her. They were angry at her. because she was a lower class person in their mind. She was not popular, was not well known. And she had said these things about this boy. Nobody claimed apparently that it wasn't true, just that it was wrong of her to ruin his life. So she was going through all that too, and I'm sure all of that, there's no question all of that contributed to her suicide attempt. We talked about all of that for 45 minutes or so, and I couldn't see any emotion that would lead me to believe that this led to her, this alone led to her trying to kill herself. And so I got to that question, the one I mentioned to you earlier. I said, you know, you mentioned that school is hard for you. I wonder, was it always hard for you? Yes, it was always hard for me. When you first started in school, kindergarten, first grade, was there any part of school that was harder for you than the rest? Maybe your behavior? No, I never got in trouble. How was math? I was always pretty good at math. What about reading? And the room went silent. She tilted her head down. I heard Mom doing something. I looked to the left. She was digging through her purse for tissues because Mother had begun to cry when her daughter mentioned. She didn't cry for any of the other parts of the story, but she cried for that. She cried over the fact that her daughter had struggled to read so badly. And her sister started to wipe tears from her eyes. And the sister volunteered that she could remember reading to her sister when she was young, because the school told them, you need to read to her more, you need to read to her more. So they read to her incessantly, and her 3 older siblings all took turns reading to her. And it didn't matter. The mother commented, remembering about how she would struggle so terribly reading the words on the page. She would get to so many words she didn't know, and she would struggle. They would work with her, and she would finally figure out what the word was. And a sentence later, or a page later, the same word would pop up. It was like she had never seen it before. And the girl's face had changed, and there was some tearing in her eyes. And she commented how bad that was, how hard that was, how embarrassing it still was, how shameful it still was to her that she struggled to read. She was afraid she wasn't going to graduate from high school. She had 3 older siblings who had either completed college or were still in college. And she was afraid she wouldn't graduate from high school. I did a quick sort of seat of my pants phonemic awareness test with her to see if she had any phonological awareness, any phonemic awareness at all. She couldn't do it. She couldn't do it. I asked her if she or her family had ever heard the term phonological awareness or phonemic awareness, and they had never heard it. When I was done with her, I called her school district and spoke to their reading specialist who was in charge of the reading programs for the whole district. And I asked her if they had any testing or any remedial work they did with her or other children on phonological awareness. And they said, that's not something we do. She'd have to go someplace else for that. There was no place else. I commented to her, I said, it seems to me that your memories of struggling to read are harder for you than being away from your family or being sexually assaulted. And her mother started crying harder, and her sister started crying harder. She said, I'll be back to my family at some point. I'm already getting it worked out with them. We're already fixing our relationship. I'll be back to them soon. I know I'll be back to them soon. And the rapes, I don't think that's going to happen again. And eventually that'll be behind me. I'm already putting it behind me. People are helping me with that. I'm already putting that in the past. But not being able to read, that's every day. That's all the time. That's right now. That's never going away. So yeah, that's worse. The fundamentals of development. It pays to take a little time here and talk about, what are the fundamentals of human development. Humans develop continuously over the course of their lifetime. I'm 59 years old. I've developed since I was 55. At 55, I had developed some since I was 50. But with human development, we focus mostly on children for 2 reasons. One, the way children are wired and built, they represent in childhood the period of time during which development is the most rapid, the most obvious, and the most important. And part of what makes it the most important is because children come into the world not a blank slate, but needing a period of rapid development to launch them into the world and to get them started. And how that development goes has a lot to do with the course of the rest of your life. Things that happened to me in my 20s and 30s affect me now, but things that happened or didn't happen to me in my infancy and in my childhood affect me even more. They affect the trajectory of a person's life. Little differences early in life can make big differences later in life. It's not guaranteed, but particularly as we accumulate little differences that all push us in one direction early on, they have 50 years to affect you, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years to affect you, to affect the course of your life. It's sort of the compound interest of development. You know, if you put money in the bank, compound interest helps it to grow. If you put it in the bank a lot longer ago, it has grown a lot more. That compound interest has worked its magic, has exerted its forces on your bank account much more than for the money that you deposited last week or last month. The same way with development. The developmental experiences that you have and don't have early on. And that's why we focus so much more on development, because development is rapid and dramatic and easily observed in early childhood. And because problems with development in those years are essential. So I'm going to put forth a theory to you, posit a model of development. It says that there are basically three pillars of development, which are essential and at the foundation of all healthy development of children and human beings. And it doesn't matter whether you grew up in a certain neighborhood, whether you grew up with money or without money, whether you grew up in the United States or you grew up in Mongolia, you grew up in Kazakhstan or Nigeria, Tanzania, or in Europe, grew up in South America, you grew up in a slum, or you grew up in a wealthy house. These three things are common. They're common. They're shared in common by everybody because they're built in terms of the developmental machine. These are parts of the machine which are essential and are common to everybody who develops, and everybody develops. The first of these is a sense of safety and security. The need for children early in life to develop a sense of safety and security about the world. Now, by safety and security, I don't mean just nobody hurts me or people feed me. Those things are essential. At one point, we thought that's what children really needed when they were little, that was the most prominent way that children got the sense of safety and security, that they were kept safe from harm, nobody hurt them, absent a bad thing, that's a good thing, right? It's an experience you don't have, you don't get hurt, and you have that in a way that's good for you. And the idea of security, that somebody feeds you when you're hungry, they change your diaper when you're wet, they keep you warm when you're cold, those sorts of very basic physical needs. What we understand now, very dramatically, is that the safety and security of children, if anything, those basic needs are superficial. They're necessary, they're important, but they're far from all we need. If all we do is feed children, keep them warm, keep them physically safe, if that's all we do for them to establish safety and security, they're doomed. There's an emotional need for safety and security, emotional safety and security, being held, being nurtured, the opportunity to attach successfully to adults, the opportunity to attach, to love, to have that deep physiological attachment and emotional attachment to another human being, and to have, so that just their presence, just their touch is comforting and pleasing to you, is absolutely essential to their development. And it wasn't that long ago that people questioned that. One of the things we have to understand, it wasn't that long ago. There were studies done in England after World War II, through the late 40s into the early 50s, which started to reveal that this was true. And people were skeptical, despite the data. Experts were skeptical. They were highly skeptical as to whether this was true, all the way into the 60s. Whether children really needed to be loved and held, whether they really needed that sense of attachment. That can't really be true. They're just little eating and pooping and crying machines. They don't need that. We do it as adults because we like to do it. We pick them up and hold them because we like to hold them. We hold them close because we enjoy it, but they don't need it. We like it, but they don't need it. That was the view. And then research in England, mostly by a guy named Michael Rudder, who later became Sir Michael Rudder, looking at the aftermath of kids who had been displaced from their parents and from their caregivers by World War II, by the bombing of London. Tracked these kids through the course of their life and matched up what became of them with the period of time in their life that was disrupted and the conditions under which they were cared for during the evacuation of London. Were they cared for by loving relatives in the country? Were they cared for in a home by surrogate parents who cared for them? Or were they cared for in more of an orphanage setting where they got relatively little attention? Were they taken away from their parents at 3 or 4, which was tragic, but was well after they had developed an important attachment? Or were they taken away in the early years of their life before they had a chance to develop a secure attachment? And he could see that the kids whose opportunity for attachment was most disrupted went on to disastrous lives. They had very poor developmental outcomes. They were very different from other children in terms of their accomplishments at school, the quality of the relationships, the likelihood they would be arrested, their care and concern for other people. This was definitive proof. And then there was a series of experiments that were done at the University of Wisconsin, about 95 miles that way. They were absolutely critical, and many of you have heard of these studies, the wire and cloth mother studies, where monkeys were taken away from their mothers and placed on surrogate mothers, either wire mothers or cloth mothers. The wire mother had a bottle that would feed the baby whenever it wanted to eat. The cloth mother had no bottle. To hang on to the cloth mother continuously would have led to starvation. And Harry Harlow theorized that he believed in Rudder's research, and Harry Harlow theorized that the same thing that was true of children would be true of monkeys, not even apes, but monkeys. The world scoffed at him. Researchers thought he was crazy. His colleagues all across the world thought he had gone on a bender. But in fact, what Harlow found was the monkeys greatly preferred the cloth mother, the sense of touch, the ability to cling, over the mother that would feed them, to the point that they would almost starve themselves rather than leave that mother and go drink from a bottle. And if you brought the wire mother with the bottle close enough, they would hang on to the cloth mother with as much of their body as they could, as many of their limbs as they could, and lean over and eat real quick and then come back. More importantly, what Harlow found was all of these monkeys were devastated. Having not been raised by an actual mother, having not been held, having not been rocked, having not been comforted, having not had that genuine touch of a mother in their life. All of these monkeys were devastated. They grew up, they were terrible children in monkey terms. They were terrible teenagers. They were awful adults. They made miserable parents. They did a terrible job of parenting when they were able to become parents, and most of their infants had to be taken away from them. And the consequences of that deep developmental failure in their life could be seen for multiple generations as it was passed on from one monkey to another, to another, to another at the Wisconsin Regional Primate Research Facility. This is the most important research probably ever done in Wisconsin, and some of the most important developmental research done anywhere. And it remains a critical study. And it documents the essential nature of safety and security in the life of children. The second of the 3 pillars in development of all children everywhere, regardless of where they live and regardless of their circumstances, is language. Later it'll include reading, but in the beginning it's just language. Children need language, they need words. Our brain is wired for words. One of the reasons our heads are so damn big, one of the reasons the bones of our skull don't even grow all the way together before we're born, because our brains are so big, they're pushing those bones apart as we're growing as a fetus. They're pushing them apart fast enough that they can't quite grow together before they're born. It's because so much of our brain is set aside, is wired up specially, is built with this tremendous amount of developmental neurological horsepower, anticipating and waiting for the chance to soak up language, to understand language, to eventually produce language. That makes our brains enormous. There's other things that make our brains enormous too, but really enormous and really complex, more so than other species on the planet. Our brains are really packed in there because there's so much going on. And the driving force of that is language. We know that brains of developing children are sorting out they aren't learning words yet, but they're starting to notice the difference between words and other sounds almost as soon as they're born, maybe before they're born. That their brains react differently to a word, to a voice, to a human voice speaking than it does to ordinary sounds in the environment. They're already sorting that out because there's parts of their brain that thirst for that, that are wired for that, that are evolved for that, that are driven to do it. They're waiting from the moment of birth to do their job. And this makes language a fundamental, essential part of human development. Language isn't just something brains do, it's something they need to do. They don't just happen to develop language or just happen to soak up words. They are designed from the bottom up to need language, to thirst for words, to respond differently to words and language than they respond to anything else. And this reflects a fundamental evolved nature of language, just as we have an evolved need for safety and security, an evolved need for language that can't be denied. And if kids are starved of language, it's not that different developmentally than being starved of safety, being starved of security, being starved of food. To be starved of language is a tragedy, and it leaves its mark on a child's developmental trajectory well into adulthood. And the third fundamental pillar of healthy early development is relationships. If our brains are essentially wired for two things, language, the other one is relationships. We are driven to have relationships. We thirst for human beings. Children recognize at an early age the difference between people and other things. And they begin to make the association of people with all their other experiences. And they learn, hopefully, if they feel safe, if they feel secure, if they're developing language, they learn that relationships to people are special. They need them. They thirst for them. They hunger for them. If there are specific parts of our brain that are dedicated to language, the rest of our brain remains on call all the time to deal with social relationships and social interactions, all the time. It's the other thing that makes our brains so big and our heads so big. We are not really great at many things as human beings, but we are phenomenally good at language, and we are amazingly skilled at relationships. We cannot see like a hawk, we cannot smell like a dog, we can't do sonar under the water like dolphins and whales, but we do these two things, language and relationships, to a level and with a degree of complexity that is really mind-boggling. And the only way we can do that is that our brains are absolutely wired up for it, they're driven to it, it is essential to us. These three things together form the foundation, the early foundation and the continuing foundation of healthy relationships, of healthy development and successful development. They're absolutely essential. If you take one of them away, if you deny one of them to a child, there will be consequences. If you deny two of them to a child, it will be a disaster guaranteed. The other thing to keep in mind is that as children grow up, even if they have these things, they can start to lose them. A child on a good language pathway may have a change in their life circumstances. It's the course at which they do the pathway, the trajectory of the development of language may flatten out. An individual may have access to a lot of good relationships, and then something may change, and the pattern of their relationships may change. Individuals who have a sense of safety and security may have that sense of safety and security threatened. But if they had it at one time, they have a chance of getting it back. If they didn't have it, and they didn't have it for too long, the opportunity to rebuild that, to build that from nothing, is very small and enormously challenging. So let's do a little quick review of the classic developmental stages as they would be described by Freud or Erikson. Erikson built on Freud's work. You may remember some of this. And you'll see that what I'm talking about is completely consistent with classic models of development that were developed, that were established through observation. The early stages of development, Freud didn't use words like attachment or bonding, but that's what he was talking about having a sense of comfort and safety and security in the world. The need to understand trust versus mistrust, as Erickson put it, trust versus mistrust. That you trusted that the world would care for you, and you learned that sometimes that care was imperfect. It didn't come as fast as you wanted, but by and large, the world cared for you, and you learned to trust the world and the people in it, that they had your best interests at heart. After that, we get into periods of development that involve social development. Well, language and relationships are all about social development. Even Freud's fixation on things like toilet training reflect an issue of social development. The whole point of toilet training and why Freud saw it as such an important thing, and I think he exaggerated it, I think he got preoccupied with it. But still, it's a very interesting idea that the reason is that a child in a short period of time goes from living under a circumstance in which they are the center of everything, the center of their own universe. The world comes to them. I cry, the world comes to me. I poop, somebody cleans it up. I'm hungry, somebody puts food in my mouth. To being in a world where they have to negotiate their environment with others, where it's not all about them. You know, infants are inherently, appropriately self-involved and wildly infantilely narcissistic. But already by 1.5 to 2.5 years old, we're asking them to fit themselves in with other people in the world, to wait. That requires relationship. That struggle between me and you, am I going to be in it for myself or am I going to be worried about you, begins very, very early. And toilet training, somewhat humorously, is a real milestone in that. It's a real milestone in that. If you think about it, in a fairly short period of time, given human development, we take a child from a point where they can pee or poop whenever they want to the point where we come to them and say, I need something from you. We don't say it this way, but I'd like you to do a favor for me. Don't just poop whenever you want to. Come over here and poop in this special place. It's not better for the child. It's not better for them, but it's better for us. And it's this first major milestone in a child's life where we ask them very overtly to do something for others, to make a change in what they do, to make a decision about what they do, to exercise some self-control in a way that will be better for all the people around you. That's a major step towards empathy. That's a major step towards taking into account the concerns and the needs of people around you. You know, if kids get through those stages well, if they develop a sense of safety and security, if they develop that sense of safety and security, if they develop relationships, if they develop language, all these things start to interact with each other. Because I have language, I can develop better relationships. Because I'm in relationships, I develop more language. Because I have stronger relationships and better language, I feel inherently safer, like the world is going well for me. And all three of these pillars are enhanced. If one of them is threatened, if your sense of safety and security is threatened, you can turn to language and relationships to build it back up. That's a kind of resilience. That's a kind of deep developmental resilience in which we use various skills, strengths, and resources to make up for temporary threats to other aspects of our skills and resources. You think, you know, you all work in education, you think about it, if all of that goes well, kids are ready to be dropped off at school at 5 or 6 years old, some, you know, often younger now in this country, and to be placed in the company of what might be complete strangers, and yet get to know them, trust them, form relationships, negotiate rules and expectations with them, be able to follow the rules and expectations of others. Freud and Erickson said this was because these people stood in, you know, the teachers and the adults stood in the place like a placeholder for the parent to whom the child had a close relationship. There's a lot of truth in that. If you learn to trust your parents and other adults to love you and care for you and keep you safe, it's much easier in kindergarten and first grade to believe that these adults will also love you, care for you, and keep you safe. On the other hand, if you didn't have that, this is going to be very difficult for you. If you've made friends before and played with people before and had it go well, it's easier to believe and to be good at forming new relationships with these other children in the room who you didn't meet until a few minutes ago. All because of that. We'll come back to some of these ideas a little bit later. Psychosocial trauma. We all hear about trauma and trauma-informed care. You can't work with human beings and not be inundated over the last number of years with ideas about demand that we focus more on trauma and trauma-informed care. That is absolutely appropriate. It's absolutely good. It's absolutely critical that we think about trauma and are aware of trauma in these important times. But it's also important that we think about what we mean by psychosocial trauma. The revolution of trauma-informed care and the recognition of psychosocial trauma, the increased recognition of psychosocial trauma as a driving force in communities and in human lives, is not the sudden realization by people like me going, oh, trauma, yeah, that might be important. We always knew trauma was important. When I saw a child years ago who was 8 years old and had been threatened with a gun by his mother, true story, the worst of it, she took him out into a cemetery and made him try to dig his own grave, held a gun to his head, was threatened to kill him when the grave was deep enough. The problems he had after that, and there were many somewhat less traumatic experiences, the problems he had after that, we knew that was related to his trauma. Before anybody had come up with the notion of trauma-informed care, and everybody's talking trauma, 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 we weren't stupid. We didn't think that wasn't going on. We didn't miss that. Oh, that's why he does these things. It was obvious to everybody. Everybody recognized that. The revolution in trauma-informed care and psychosocial trauma is not the recognition that big, dramatic, spectacular traumas sometimes have big, dramatic, spectacular negative effects on people. It's a different recognition. It's a recognition that small, dripping, constant, monotonous, lower level trauma, in many cases, is doing similar kinds of harm. It's not a sudden fire hose of trauma that is the thing we need to worry about the most, although when it happens, it's a big deal. It's the drip, drip, drip of daily trauma in the lives of many of our children that wears them down progressively over time. Any one of the traumas might not look that spectacular. They get bullied. It's one time, but it's not one time. It happens over and over again. Besides that, when they go home, they're not sure if their mother is going to be there. They have food anxiety. They have financial anxieties because their family is poor. They're worried about what's going to happen the next day. They're concerned about how they're doing in school. They're concerned about their sister or their brother. And all those stresses, all those traumas. You know, I met a kid one time who got jumped twice in the same year going to school. And he explained to me that being jumped wasn't as bad as being afraid of being jumped every single day. Wasn't as bad as going to bed at night and having to worry that he would get jumped the next day. Wasn't as bad as walking to school with his head on a swivel, worried he was going to get jumped, or walked home with his head on a swivel, worried that he was going to get jumped. He had a tremendous insight, and he was right, that it was the constant drip, drip, drip of concern that it was going to happen again. Overall, was worse for his life than the 2 times it had actually happened. That recognition that he put so beautifully, that's the revolution of trauma-informed care and psychosocial trauma, is that we realize the number of people deeply affected by trauma is not the small number who've been traumatized in spectacular, devastating ways, but the much larger number who have been affected by direct and indirect trauma that's just repetitive and monotonous and goes on and on and on and on. You know, if I tapped on your forehead, I knew a girl once who tapped on her forehead like this ritually. She would just tap herself in the same spot, no harder than I am now. And she did it so constantly and so continuously, and she actually wore a hole in her skin about the size of a quarter all the way down to the bone. The worst trauma is like that. It wears down to the bone. No one tap seems to be anything to worry about. But the accumulated effect of all that trauma wears our children down to the bone. Trauma, a synonym for trauma is injury. You know, when you go to a trauma center where they deal with physical injury, this becomes obvious. It's a trauma center. It deals with injury. Psychosocial trauma is also an injury. It changes the brain. It is an injury to your psyche. It is an injury to the neurology of your brain. It trains your brain to be a way that is not good for the rest of your life. It is not good for the rest of the things you do. Certain areas of your brain become more active. Certain parts of your brain become less active and less organized, less efficient. And over time, that's not good for you. It's like building the wrong muscles for what you really want to do. It's like building up one side of your body too much and the other side of your body not enough. It's going to cause problems. And it does cause problems in folks who have suffered psychosocial injury. We can see these injuries in testing. We can see these injuries in observed behavior. And we can see these injuries in advanced neurological imaging. Even though I'm not talking about injuries from being hit or actual physical trauma, I'm talking about injuries just from the repeated psychosocial stress. Hormone levels are different, adrenaline levels are different, the body responds differently to future stress, the brain activates differently to stress. Oftentimes, it becomes very, very overreactive to minor stress and remarkably underreactive to things that it should have a big reaction to. I saw a young boy one time, a teenage boy who had been through a lot of trauma, and he was very preoccupied with every movement he would see outside his windows, every tiny little thing. And yet he would go walking through his neighborhood at night and confront drug dealers who would hold guns to his forehead. And he said, "My heartbeat doesn't even go up." He could be freaked out by a little bit of movement outside the window, but you could stick a gun to his forehead and he didn't care. ACEs. You may have heard of the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. One of the most important things to understand about the ACEs study, and we all have heard of ACEs, it was a short list of questions, have these things ever happened to you? Originally done by Kaiser Permanente in Southern California. It showed that kids who accumulated more ACEs, and I think 4 was the critical number, if you had 4 or more yes answers to these stressful experiences that we hope nobody would say yes to. So if you said, wasn't that if you said yes to 1, that group of kids was all that different than other kids. Once you got up to 4, that accumulated traumatic stress, that had a dramatic effect on your future outcomes, on your use of healthcare, your success in school, your success in relationships, the likelihood you would be arrested, the likelihood you would have bad outcomes in life. The thing to remember about ACEs is the original ACEs survey was done on a middle and upper middle class population of people. It was not done in impoverished neighborhoods. It applies more to impoverished neighborhoods where stress and trauma are more common. But it wasn't done there. So then they tried to transfer the ACEs survey to an urban setting, and I believe they first tried to do it in Philadelphia. The study fell apart because everybody got 10 out of 10. The number of people who had 8, 9, 10 stressful traumatic experiences in Southern California in a middle class population was exceptionally rare, thank God. In the urban population and a poor urban Black population in Philadelphia, it was almost everybody. So they had no variability in the outcome. They couldn't get any results. So they wrote a new ACEs filled with terrible, terrible events that nobody experienced in the other neighborhood, that were still somewhat common in the Philadelphia neighborhood. And again, they found that the more of these you had, the worse you did. So that continuum of stress that they identified in ACEs, that having 4 was sort of a critical moment, but having 6 was worse than 4, and 8 was worse than 6, and 10 was certainly worse than 8, continued on a whole other continuum of more and more and more severe trauma. And that correlation held up over time. This is not surprising to us when we stop and think about it, but nobody had really documented that before. And the most striking thing was the contrast between the 2 studies. The levels of stress and trauma that were thankfully somewhat rare and uncommon in suburban, white, privileged neighborhoods were ordinary. They were absolutely the baseline in urban, Black, underprivileged communities. People sort of knew that before that, but I don't think they knew how common it was. That opened a lot of eyes. Repeated or super severe acute psychosocial trauma risks permanent changes in the brain. You know, if I break your leg, it'll heal. And if I break it again in the same spot, it'll heal again. At some point, if I break your leg in the same spot enough time, your body will give up and just say, well, screw you, and it will stop trying to heal. And you'll have to go to great lengths to get it to heal. And it might not work. It's the same thing with psychosocial trauma. The changes that occur in the brain is changed by trauma and the brain recovers. The brain is changed by trauma and the brain recovers. But eventually, if the brain is changed enough times and traumatized enough while it's still trying to recover, it doesn't recover. And something different becomes the new normal. So you get your brain gets traumatized and it recovers a little bit, but it never goes back to where it was before. That's what PTSD is. Not all responses to trauma are PTSD, but some responses to trauma that become permanent or are on the verge of becoming more permanent. Those changes we refer to as PTSD. That's the neurological basis of PTSD. You know, this is very similar to what we see in the NFL with the concussion protocol. The worst thing if you have a concussion, so you have an injury to your brain, you have a concussion, and you're recovering. The worst thing that can happen to you is to have another injury to your brain while you're still recovering, before you're fully recovered. Same thing with trauma. You suffer a little bit of trauma, and before you can recover from it, you get a little bit more. Before you can recover from that, you get a little bit more. Before you recover from that, you get a little bit more. And it's a deficit model of development. You get into a developmental deficit as these traumas keep pushing you backwards. Sometimes we go looking for what's the one big trauma that did it to the kid. I see these kids all the time, and somebody says, hey, he doesn't have much of a trauma history. What they mean is he doesn't have the big, spectacular, standout trauma. Never saw his mother murdered. She was, a girl was never raped. But the constant drip, drip, drip of trauma that's just infused into their life has had a dramatic effect. There's a huge range of trauma, from very minor to very severe. People can recover from even profoundly severe traumas if they have other necessary developmental resources, if they are well-loved, well-cared for, if they have been well-loved and well-cared for up to this point in their life, if they continue to be well-loved and cared for afterwards. It's amazing what people, particularly women, can recover from, the resilience that they can show. But if you have a severe trauma and you don't have those other developmental resources, the likelihood you will recover from that trauma goes down. The period of time it will take to recover from that trauma becomes longer and longer, putting you at greater risk of another trauma while it's going on because it takes you longer to recover. You're vulnerable for a longer period of time. There are also less severe traumas, and those repeated over time can be quite profound. Most of the kids we see who suffer severe traumatic reactions it's the result sometimes of a mixture of these things. Mild and moderate traumas that repeat fairly often, sometimes interspersed with very dramatic, spectacular traumas that add to the mix. And again, it's this idea of severe and acute trauma versus chronic and less severe trauma. I don't want anybody to be traumatized. I don't want kids to be traumatized. But when it comes to psychosocial trauma, assuming you have love and care and support and your life has been good up until this point, and you've had a good chance to develop, you have a sense of safety and security in the world, you'd probably be better off being very severely traumatized one time and given a nice period of time to recover from it and never happens again, than to be hit with this mild and moderate trauma that just repeats over and over and over and over again. Illiteracy is trauma. This experience of illiteracy is trauma, in a specific case that I'm going to talk to you about right now, prompted me to coin the term, excuse me, I'm just going to check the time here real fast, caused me to coin the term shame fatigue. I developed the term shame fatigue, talking to a particular young lady who I'm going to tell you about. This was a girl who I had heard about. She was on my radar. She was involved in a system of care that I help manage and provide clinical support to. These are some of the most challenging kids who come to our attention in Milwaukee County. And many of them are minority children, but not all of them. This was not a minority child. She lived in a suburb in Milwaukee County. She was running, she was gone, she was not in school, she was being trafficked or was trafficking herself. She was willingly going along with experiences that were quite tragic. She was involved in drugs. And by gone, I don't mean overnight. She was gone for weeks at a time. She would just disappear and not come back. And when she did come back, her parents would be desperate, trying to keep her at home, trying to get her help. Sure enough, she'd be gone again just as fast as they could respond. And they were good people. They were really good people. They were well-educated, hardworking people from a nice home in a good neighborhood. And it made you wonder, how did this happen? Why did this happen with this girl? And she was home. She would come home. She would clean up. She would eat because she didn't eat well when she was running. She would eat. She'd get cleaned up. She'd sleep most of the time. She'd do some laundry. She'd gather up some clothes. And everybody knew she was going to leave again. And I was on notice the next time she comes back, let me know and I'm going to try to talk to her. I wanted to talk to her. And I got the call and I went out there. It was a nice spring day. She agreed to talk to me, which really surprised people. They were really afraid she was going to run. She agreed to talk to me, but under certain conditions. We had to talk outside. We ended up settling that we would talk in the garage. We sat on plastic chairs in the garage. The garage door, two-car garage, had to be open so that nobody could block her escape if she decided she needed to run. And she had to be allowed to sit closer to the door than I was, because she believed in her speed and her athleticism, and believed, probably rightly so, that if she needed to, she could jump up from that chair and bolt out the door and be gone, and that none of us could catch her. She was probably right about that. So I met her. She was this tiny little thing. She was bedraggled. She looked tired. Just being around her, you felt the weight of her exhaustion. It just weighed you down. It felt like it. Her hands looked old. I remember she had tried to do a manicure for herself and it looked poor. It was not well done. She had some makeup on and it wasn't done well, and her hair looked like she needed a cut. She needed some work on it. Just, you could feel how worn out and exhausted she was. We talked about different things. We talked about what she did and where she went and the drugs she used, and she was careful not to implicate anybody else or to give up the people she was involved in. She didn't want them to get in trouble. She was adamant that we would understand that even though she was 16 and she knew that, you know, the adults she was with were in danger for that, nobody was making her do anything that was important to her, that we understood that we didn't think we were going to get anything out of her we could use to prosecute the men and women who were mistreating her this way. She talked in a very ordinary way about the things she did. She didn't give me certain details, but she talked about things in a very ordinary, bland sort of way. And I commented on that. Much like the girl in the hospital bed, I said, this really kind of surprises me. You know, we're talking about some big things here. We're talking about things that most kids your age don't do. If they did them, they would deny them. They wouldn't talk about them so easily. She says, yeah, but I'm not one of those kids. We talked about what would keep other kids, why other kids mostly don't do these things. And she agreed with me that one of the reasons other kids don't do these things is because if they did them, they would feel ashamed. They would feel that sense of shame in themselves if they did these things. They wouldn't want to feel that. It stopped them from doing things. I said, why don't you feel shame over these things? And she thought about it for a little while. She says, oh, I feel shame about it. I feel ashamed about all these things. I said, why doesn't it stop you? She says, well, I feel ashamed all the time. I've felt ashamed since I was a little kid. I feel ashamed every day. It's nothing for me to feel ashamed. And I asked her, why? What is it you feel ashamed about? She said, oh, they haven't told you. I can't read. She went on and explained to me, she could remember quite vividly in first grade and second grade, people working with her trying to teach her to read. She absolutely couldn't read, but she got really good at faking an ability to read. She got really good at convincing people she could read. She said, you know, the teachers, they'd have us in these groups and we would read along. We would read, people would read things and they'd ask questions. And I was good at avoiding my part for reading, or I was good at memorizing that section of the book. so that I could fake it and they would think that I could read. It was still bad if I had to read out loud, but I was good at faking it. I was good at making up answers. I paid really close attention to what other people said, and I gave answers like them. So people thought I could read. She said I couldn't read any of it. She said by 3rd grade, they were starting to figure out that she couldn't read. And she got very good at creating trouble for herself. She said, like, the worst thing in 3rd grade, the teacher used to call on you and ask you to read a section of a book, like not a storybook we had read many times before, but like a social studies book. I said, how would you deal with that? She said, well, I'd just get myself thrown out of class. She'd throw something. She'd hit somebody. She'd swear at the teacher. She'd do anything, but you'd get in trouble for that. Yeah, but that was better than having everybody listen to me not be able to read. So she wanted me to understand that she had been ashamed of herself since she was 6 or 7 years old. So being a little more ashamed or being ashamed in a different way wasn't a big deal. So shame stopped preventing her from doing these other things. Shame didn't cause her to go home. Shame didn't protect her from these horrible developmental experiences because she had gotten so used to feeling ashamed that it didn't matter anymore. Some of you have, or you work with people who have kids who have been diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder. Reactive attachment disorder is a uniquely developmental condition. So most of the psychiatric disorders we deal with, and PTSD and RAD are exceptions, most of the psychiatric disorders we deal with have strong genetic components to them. None of them are caused entirely by genetics, but all of them are caused by interaction between genetics and the environment. You have to have a genetic risk or predisposition to depression, psychosis, anxiety. You probably need a predisposition to them. It certainly helps. And then you have certain experiences in life, or you are denied certain experiences in life. And the interaction between those two categories of things leads to a psychiatric disorder in childhood or later in your life. RAD is the exception. RAD is a notable exception. And RAD is similar to PTSD, but it's different. It's tied to one specific developmental trauma, and that is that you never have a chance. You never develop that sense of safety and security early in life. You don't get a chance to develop it, and because you don't get a chance to develop it, you grow up as a different human being. You're missing a part of yourself. I saw a young man years ago who had been brutally traumatized by his birth family from birth through age 4. He's removed from their care and placed with some foster parents who adopted him. And either because they were not warm and nurturing, or because warmth and nurturance just didn't matter to him anymore. He never really attached to them. There wasn't a lot of bond. That experience was not as recuperative, was not as restorative for him as everybody would hope, because he was already 4 and his life had been so bad. It was obvious to me that he had reactive attachment disorder. Now, the interesting thing about reactive attachment disorder is these kids, it causes a deep difficulty in understanding the motivations of other people and in forming relationships. But it also, because of that lack of relationship, it denies them the insight into themselves. So many times, this young man, what happened was, he believed he was quite a spectacular individual. He believed he was quite capable of many things. He believed he was doing great and couldn't understand why the world was so upset with him over the many things that he did that were destructive and disrupted the lives of others. I saw him on and off for a number of years, and there was an interesting moment when he was 17 years old and was waiting to go off to juvenile prison. Might have been 16. He was waiting to go off to juvenile prison. I went in to see him, and I said, well, it's really going to happen this time. And he commented to me, he says, I've been thinking a lot. He said, I used to think there was more of me than everybody else. And now I know there's less. Now I know there's less. He had come to a point that he had the insight and realized how many pieces of himself that were supposed to be there were missing. Like he's trying to put together a puzzle of his life, and the pieces just weren't in the box. He didn't have the pieces that other people had, and he was very sad about that. That's an example of reactive attachment disorder, kids who fail to develop that attachment. It's different than PTSD in the sense that it becomes before PTSD. It's not kids who have a sense of safety and security in the world that have that sense of safety and security profoundly violated. that could lead to PTSD. So they never had the sense of safety and security in the world. For these kids, the ability to develop language is absolutely, even more, if that's possible, is more essential for them than for other kids. It's absolutely essential that they develop the ability to use words, because words are going to enhance those few relationships they have. They're going to give them a better chance of developing the few relationships they have. And it's through those relationships that we have any chance at all of filling in the gaps. There will always be gaps in them as human beings, but we have a chance to fill in those gaps a little bit through language and relationships. And we don't fill them in dramatic ways. We don't fill them in all at once. It isn't the one big relationship that's going to change their life. It's good, steady, capable relationships that occur steadily over time. It's the accumulation of those relationships, the nurturance, the fresh water of those relationships and of language that occurs over years, even over decades. This goes back, RAD was identified by Michael Rutter, who I already mentioned in the bombing of Britain studies, and Harlow. Harlow really identified the notion of RAD in monkeys, something that I had already mentioned. Denying people these opportunities to have relationships and have a sense of safety and security in the world affects them at such a deep level. It really is an insult to the essence of our humanity. I don't say this lightly, and I don't say this in a trivial way, but these kids are at risk of not being full persons in the way we want them to. You know, we want kids to grow up. I sometimes say that, you know, you become an adult in our culture. You know you're becoming an adult when you wake up for Christmas for the first time, assuming that's a holiday you celebrate. You wake up for Christmas for the first time, and you're more excited to see how other people will react to what you got them than you are to see what's under the tree for you. If you have reactive attachment disorder, if you've had bad developmental experiences, if you've been denied language and relationships, it's hard to reach that point. And you, in many ways, remain a child or even an infant at a certain level for the rest of your life. But there's neurological consequences of these things. There's neurological markers of these things. The neurological consequences of trauma, kids who experience lots of trauma and traumatic stress starting at an early age have smaller brains than other children. This has been shown repeatedly. They have smaller brains. There's less stuff up there. Even if there's the same number of brain cells, and there may be, the brain cells are not as thick. They're not as robust. The bodies of the cells are not as large. The fibers coming out of the cells are not as large. They're not as well coated with insulation called myelin as we see in kids who are less traumatized. And most importantly, the pattern of connections between nerve cells, where nerve cells are constantly making and pruning new connections to other cells, are reduced. And this literally changes the sheer bulk, the sheer weight and size of the brain. This is not just true in human beings, it's true in other mammals. We stress and traumatize children beginning at an early age, infants and the offspring of other mammals. Their brains are smaller. That's bad. I hope everybody understands that. That's really, really bad. That's not something you recover from overnight. It's not something we stop the trauma and a couple of days later your brain gets back to normal. If it's going to get back to something we would consider more desirable, it's going to take months, years, decades, maybe the rest of your life to recover some. There's a very good chance you will never recover as fully as we would like you to. Part of the reason their brains are smaller is because they have a smaller corpus callosum. You know, we talk about the different sides of the brain, left brain people and right brain people, and most of that's crap and wildly exaggerated and a horrible misstatement of the science of brains. You do have, your brains are, two halves of your brain are somewhat separate. The left and right hemisphere are not, they're distinct from each other. They have somewhat distinct roles and purposes in cognition and language and relationships. But they are connected to each other through a structure called the corpus callosum. You have these two halves of your brain, these two halves of your cortex, and running between them is a thick, densely created mat set of fibers, specialized nerve cells, whose whole job It's just act like a switchboard and move information back and forth from one side to another. Kids who are traumatized have smaller corpus callosums. They have less going on. They have fewer wires connecting one side of their brain to the other side of their brain. And so the communication and the organization and the collaboration between all the parts of their brain, all the skills and tools of their brain is reduced. Now I want to say something about that. This has been misunderstood sometimes. People talk, there's a lot of crap that goes on where people get really excited about whether kids can cross the midline or not. First of all, you know, whether kids cross the midline or not is wildly misunderstood. There are rare neurological conditions in which kids literally have difficulty crossing the midline. You'll see kids, believe it or not, who write with their left hand until they get to the center of their visual field, and then they would transfer to their right hand to do it for the rest of the time. These kids are exceptionally rare. Most of the little hoopy-doopy things that teachers and others have been done to assess whether kids cross the midline are not assessments of whether kids cross the midline. And the vast, vast majority of kids who we say we think they have midline issues don't have midline issues. It's just that we don't understand what we're looking at. Back to the corpus callosum. If you want to read some really interesting stuff, you can go look for the work of Sperry and Gazzaniga, Michael Gazzaniga. There was a Nobel Prize involved in their work where they did surgeries years ago that split the corpus callosum in living human beings. People who had such bad seizure disorders that the only way to stop them was to sever the one side of their brain from the other. They started with a small number of patients at VA hospitals. They were going to die if their seizures didn't stop. And the surgery stopped their seizures. They expected afterwards that they would be neurological train wrecks. Remarkably, they were not. The change in their behavior was quite subtle, but you have to remember these are brains that had developed with the corpus callosum for decades. And now we're taking that corpus callosum away from them. It was very interesting how the brain figured out workarounds around that. And if you wanted to read some of that research, at least for geeks like me, it's quite entertaining. Trauma leads to an inefficient organization of the brain. Brains that are efficient use the most appropriate parts of the brain efficiently, effectively. They don't give authority when performing certain tasks to parts of the brain that are poorly adapted for those tasks. And they perform these tasks fairly quickly, and they burn relatively few calories to do it. You know, if you watched a skilled reader and a poor reader read the same text, and you measured the amount of calories their brain was burning, the skilled reader would burn fewer calories. The unskilled reader would simply thrash around more in neurological terms to get the same amount of work done. Think of it as two swimmers in a pool, both swimming ostensibly at the same speed, side by side in lanes, but one is thrashing like an egg beater and water is going everywhere. The other one has one of those graceful strokes. One of them is burning way more energy to accomplish the same thing. It's true for everything that your brain does. Efficiently organized, skilled brains burn fewer calories, have more stamina, work more efficiently. Trauma tends to decrease the efficient organization of the brain and cause us to be not as good at everything else that we do. Trauma also tends to bias children's brains towards the right hemisphere. Now that doesn't mean they become right hemisphere people. There aren't right hemisphere people and left hemisphere people. That's mostly an exaggerated bunch of crap that's written by people who don't understand. But if we watched your brain and where your brain is working and the calories that your brain is burning and where the energy is being used in your brain, we would see your brain using energy all over the place. But over the course of the day, we would see more energy being devoted to the left side of your brain. We'd see more calories, more blood flow, generally speaking, to the left side of your brain in a typical day. And a person who's been traumatized, doing the exact same things that another person did that led to mostly left brain activity, a slight bias towards left side brain activity, relative to that person, we would see more activity in the right side of their brain. More emotion. This reflects some of the inefficient organization of how their brains function. Over time, that has a dramatic effect. If you think of it as a plumber who's going to go to 5 or 6 houses today to do repairs, if that plumber has to go back and forth to the truck more often to grab tools and grab supplies that they didn't bring the first time, they brought the wrong tool, they brought the wrong supplies, they just go back to the shop and get something else. They didn't have that with them. It slows them down. They're not going to get everything else done. They're not going to be in as good a mood at the end of the day. It's very much like that when inefficient brains are trying to do the things that everybody else does. We see a relative underactivation and underuse of the frontal lobes. You know, the brain is both organized very specifically. There's specific parts of your brain that do specific things, and generally, all parts of the brain can do more than one thing. Most of it, for most of us, most of the time, for most parts of the brain. But generally speaking, the frontal lobes are the parts of our brain, these parts up here in the front, that make us human, that make us different from other people, that allow us to comprehend language in deep ways, that allow us to engage in really sophisticated social interaction, that allow us to hypothesize and think about the future in really remarkable and complex ways. Kids who've been traumatized are firing less energy through their frontal lobes. They're doing less with their frontal lobes, and they're doing it less efficiently than kids who have not been traumatized. Over the course of their lifetime, that's bad. Just for all of you, men already have less activation in their frontal lobes than many women do, and matched at a given age. But the difference is fairly small. Trauma exaggerates that difference. It causes us to have less activation towards the front of our brain. Over time, that is not a good thing. It also reflects a deeply evolved need. It's changing the evolved natural organization of the brain in a way that we don't like. Brains are evolved and will tend to develop naturally in a certain pattern. Trauma disrupts that pattern. It reprograms evolution. It reprograms the way things go on. It's not a good thing. There's, you know, even if you recover, overall, you would have been better off not having suffered that trauma. The neurological basis of language, and I encourage you to keep in mind some of the things I just said, you know, this last slide, what I said about trauma. Sort of keep this image in your head as we think about what's the neurological basis for language. Language helps organize the brain. Language is not just the beneficiary of a well-organized brain. It is one of the driving forces. The quest for language, the drive to produce and understand language, forces the brain, inspires the brain to get organized in a certain way. You know, we all know, or we should know, that there are certain areas of the brain that are specifically critically involved in language, both the production and perception and comprehension of oral language as well as written language. The written language function is not evolved. We have to learn it. We have to train it. The oral language part is evolved. And part of that organization is a benefit to the whole brain. It helps us to do everything else better because it forces us to be organized. You know, if you go in and organize your office, so you can find your office supplies more effectively, you're probably going to find everything else more effectively too. If you organize the garage so the car fits in better, you're also going to benefit when you look for your tools or look for oil or look for the lawnmower. You're going to benefit from it every time because it's more organized. You have everything's more in its place and it functions better. It promotes a left hemisphere bias. Trauma drives us towards the right hemisphere. Language drives us towards the left hemisphere. Let me disabuse you of some notions. You know, these maps that show the 4 little sections of your brain that are responsible for reading wrongly imply to people, and I understand why they get this message, that there's these 4 discrete spots in your brain, and those are the things that take care of reading. 3 of them take care of language as well. Your whole brain is involved in reading and language. It's just that these 3 or 4 spots are in charge when that goes on. You're using lots of your brain, but you're using these parts in specific critical ways. It's absolutely essential. to understand that it's not just those parts of your brain. Don't ever get into that idea. Our whole brains are active when we're reading, but we see a bias. We see more left hemisphere activity, and we see an increase in activity in these specific regions of the brain. As long as I'm talking about it now, I want to point something out to you. I'm trying to get the license. It's not my video, so I can't show it in a presentation. Nadine Gabb has it. I believe it came from Stanislas Dehaene. A video where we can watch the brain read. You can literally watch the brain decode a word in a fraction of a second. It's measured out in milliseconds. And what we see is an activation in the back of the brain on the left side, which is, we know from what the parts of the brain do, that is a recognition of the letters that is then passed on to the sounds that those letters represent. The word is called up. If it's a known word, it's called up from the word bank. If it's not a known word, it's immediately and expertly decoded. This is what skilled reading looks like. Then all of that is passed to the front of the brain for comprehension. That happens in a 10th to a 6th of a second, and it goes from back to front. The reason that matters is that it's absolute proof. It is absolute, undeniable proof. This is how all skilled readers read phonological phonetic language, that it starts with the recognition of letters, which inspires the recognition of sounds, which creates the identity of the word, which is then comprehended and understood. Not the other way around. We don't see anybody understand the word, and then from the understanding of the word, figure out what the word must be. There are two basic models of how kids read. One is the scientific model of reading, which says you're reading from here to here when you read words, and an old discredited model of reading, which unfortunately still holds sway in most places, says, whether people realize it or not, that you read front to back. No skilled reader reads front to back. So the neurological basis of language promotes this left hemisphere bias. The opposite of trauma. If that's true, language and the use of language and the development of reading and sophisticated language should heal trauma. It enlarges the corpus callosum because it's such a complex task and it involves all the brain. So much information is moving back and forth between the two hemispheres. The corpus callosum responds by building more connections, more robust connections. More energy is delivered. The cells don't multiply, but they become bigger and more efficient. They get more heavily myelinated and insulated so they can send signals more accurately and definitively and efficiently. Just the opposite of what trauma does to us. It promotes and builds frontal lobe activity, really good frontal lobe activity, important frontal lobe activity. Language forces our frontal lobes to come online. That's good. Later, when you need your frontal lobe for everything, it'll be a good frontal lobe. It'll be there waiting for you, all exercise. You know, if you do a lot of exercises, lifting weights, you'll probably be good at lifting flower pots. You'll probably be good at shoveling snow. Exercising those things in critical ways is good for every other way you use those parts of your body. It generates efficiency. You can't be good at language with an inefficient brain. It's such a demanding thing. You can't do it in some hoopy-doopy way. Your brain has to do it well or it won't be able to do it at all. There is no inefficient way to do language well. If you're doing language well, we know you've got a good brain going on. And it reflects this deeply evolved need. Our brains are built for language, and it proves to us the way this works. This is not, you know, the fact that every brain does it the same way shows us in part that this is a deeply evolved inherent condition. Relationships. Relationships are so critical to human beings. Relationships increase brain connectivity everywhere. The interesting thing about brain connectivity too is that your brain is making millions and millions of new connections every day. They're making new connections right now. We've actually filmed live nerve cells expanding and growing out little tentacles and touching other nerve cells, making new connections. Most of those connections are not going to be sustained. Most of those connections are not going to be preserved. They shouldn't be. They shouldn't be. They were an idea, they were a try. But at night, your brain prunes them back. It's one of the reasons it's so critically important that we sleep. It's one of the essential neurological housekeeping functions that take place. Relationships all day long are building up neural connections in your brain, and at night, your brain, by a system we don't fully understand, assesses which connections are the most valuable and prunes back the rest. And over time, your brain keeps the best connections and prunes back the ones that are less effective or less useful, making room for other new connections. So we're accumulating better and better connections, higher and higher quality connections. We're sort of collecting them. We're not collecting everything. We're not collecting every neurological connection we can make. In relationships, because they drive so much brain connectivity, are producing an abundance of both low quality neural connections that we're not going to keep, but also very high quality neural connections, which will remain very valuable to us through our lifetime. And it's up to that pruning activity to prune it back, prune it back, prune it back. It's part of why we dream the way we dream and why so many of our dreams are related to social interaction and other people in odd circumstances. That's a reflection of what's going on with this pruning activity going on in your brain. It only happens when you sleep. It's one of the reasons if you don't sleep well for an extended period of time, you get foggy and you get strange and you don't feel like you're yourself. You need to sleep. Your body will be driven to sleep. You get exhausted in that really deep, deep neurological way. It's because your brain is getting clogged with these connections. Your brain is waiting to prune them back. Your brain needs to prune them back. Your brain is becoming overgrown with connections that serve no useful purpose and actually make the brain less efficient. Relationships promote language. It seems like the most obvious thing, but it bears repeating. Human relationships are the vehicle through which we develop language. I have a relationship with you, you talk to me, I talk to you. This is how we develop language. And language and relationships soothe the brain. We know this. We know this. We see somebody who's excited, who's upset, who's been traumatized, who's stressed. We slow down. We try to establish a relationship with them. We share simple, easy to understand, comforting language as a reflection of that relationship and letting them know that we want to offer them safety and security. And it soothes their brain. It helps to calm them down. It brings them back to some degree to a more organized, calm, rational, settled state of the brain. Instead of the frenetic, chaotic, fight or flight, or flee, or freeze model that the brain may be in. It transfers control from primitive parts of the brain, more advanced parts of the brain. It guides the brain, comforts the brain, it soothes the brain. We can see this in crying, distressed children, people who are in pain. You offer them some kind words, some language, some relationship, and it soothes them down, it settles them down. Our complex social drive is likely one of the main causes of our huge brains. You know, because we have relationships, we have a gigantic brain. Because we have a gigantic brain, we can do things we couldn't do otherwise. We use the brain that's driven to great size and complexity by relationship to solve other critically complex things. We have a big brain for relationships and language, but then we can use our big brain to design computers and invent vaccines and figure out complex math problems. It didn't evolve to do those things. We've taught it to do those things. It evolved for language and relationships, but it had to be so complex for language and relationships that we can co-opt that complexity for these other things. The default network refers to the idea that when you're doing nothing else, your brain is thinking about, experimenting with, hypothesizing, preparing for the next social interaction. That's how important relationships are to us and social interactions are to us. And it's closely linked to safety and survival. If you have no relationships, if you're alone long enough, like some of us have been during the quarantine, you feel less safe. You feel less comforted. You need to keep up that connection with other people in order to feel as safe and secure as you need to be. And does reflect this deeply evolved need. While there are a few people who seem not to want relationships, seem not to benefit from relationships, the vast, vast, vast majority of people do. They require them, they benefit from them, they thirst for them, they hunger for them. That's not an accident, that's not random. That's because we are designed that way. This is a quote from a neuroscientist who studies human relationship. Evolution has made a bet that the best thing for our brain to do in any spare moment is to get ready for what comes next in social terms. Matthew Lieberman coined the term, the default network of the brain. And that's what he was talking about. We get ready for that. Language makes us better at relationships. Language and relationships make us feel safer. The safer we are, the more able we are to acquire language and relationships. The three are invariably linked to each other. So it's easy to see that kids who do not feel safe in the world, who do not feel safe in their environment, who do not feel safe in their present, will struggle with language and relationships. And those who struggle with language and relationships will not feel as safe. So this is a model. This is what this would look like if I tried to diagram it as a model. I'm not good with graphics, so let me apologize in advance, but this is my crude attempt to model what this would look like. The foundation of human development then is safety and security, but perched on safety and security, like two pillars, are language and relationships. And together, they seem to be separate things, but they're not. There's this integral relationship between relationships and language, just as there is an integral relationship between language and safety and security, relationships and safety and security. Those relationships between them bind them together and form like the mortar between these pieces. So they aren't separate pieces anymore. They're so closely related, they become aspects of one thing, they become aspects of one vessel. And you can see in this diagram, how this forms a vessel. There's a space in the middle. There's a space in the middle where we can store things, where we could collect things. Because human development is not just relationships, language, and safety and security. Those are the essential things. But your home is not just walls and ceiling and electrical and all that stuff. It's all the things you have in your home. It's the memories you have in your home. It's your furniture. It's your pictures. It's your decorations, like I have all around me in my living room. Likewise, human development isn't just relationships, language, safety, and security, but relationships, language, safety, and security give you a chance to now accumulate and to hold on to those other things. If I didn't have a home, I'd have no place for these pictures. If I didn't have a home, there'd be no reason to acquire this artwork because I'd have no place to put it. Without relationships, language, safety, and security, where do you put the other things? How do you hold on to them? How do you accumulate the other experiences in your life? But if you have these things, they serve like a bucket, like a backpack. And they create a safe space in the middle of your life where you can start to accumulate hopes. You can imagine your own future. You can have hopes for your own future. That's a frontal lobe function. You can start to think about what your future is going to be, what might happen in the future. We're going to talk a lot more about that in just a little while here. Dreams, what's possible. It may not be likely, but wouldn't that be great? I know I'm never going to win the lottery, but it's fun to think about. It's very unlikely that certain things are going to happen to me, but I can imagine them. And from that imagination, I can figure out other things, other hopes that might actually be possible. You develop interests, you know. Once kids start school and before they start adolescence, what's really going on is what I refer to as the pre-season of life. We're doing the same things over and over again. We're finding out things we like, things we don't like. We're learning about new things. We're learning about old things. We're experiencing things over and over and over again. Kids watch the same movies, the same TV shows over and over again. They play the same way over and over again as they explore their world in a kind of lather, rinse, repeat sort of model. Language and relationships gives us a chance to do that. And it's absolutely essential. It's the preseason of life. It's the preseason because nothing counts. None of it goes on your permanent record when you're 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. None of it counts. None of it's permanent. You can want to be a cowboy when you're 7. It doesn't mean you're going to be a cowboy later in your life. You can want to be an astronaut. You're not going to be an astronaut. But you can have that hope and that dream, and that may drive you towards other things. You can imagine all kinds of things. Talked to a 5-year-old girl, asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up. She said she wanted to be a mermaid. Good for you. You can have these hopes, dreams, and interests. You can try something and then give it up. How many of us or our kids took clarinet lessons for 3 months and quit, played the piano but don't play anymore, used to like to draw, don't draw anymore? That's fine. That's fine. We explore, we prune, we change, we exchange, we try different things because none of it's permanent. None of it counts towards our future. It's just something we accumulate. We're not obligated. You know, some of the scariest things I ever see from kids, and I don't see this often, some of the weirdest things I ever see in people is somebody who, for instance, I knew a guy, met a guy who was going to dental school. And he insisted he was going to dental school. He had always known he wanted to be a dentist. It was the one thing he wanted to be. Maybe that's true. But it worries me that you're doing something when you're in your mid to early 20s that you decided to do when you were 6. Did you not consider other possibilities? Did this plan never go on the trash heap so you could try something else out? It kind of worries me a little bit. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it does worry me. Experiences, you know, we try things out. We have experiences. People expose us to things through relationships, through language. We get exposed to all kinds of new things. And we take them in, we keep some of them, we throw some of them away. Some people ride a horse and they know they don't ever want to be on a horse again. Other people ride a horse and they say, I want to be around horses for the rest of my life. Some people jump in the pool and never want to get out. Some people jump in the pool and say, I'm never doing that again. We have all these experiences and these things shape us. But the thing that gives us the opportunity to do it, to understand it, to accumulate it, is this foundation of relationships, language, and a sense of safety and security in the world. Talents, we have to develop our talents. Figure out what we're good at. Nobody's good at everything. You don't have to be good at everything. But you have to be good at enough things that you feel like you can build a life that you're proud of, that you can find some purpose in living and some purpose in your life. You have to be good enough at enough things. And having a life that's rich in relationships, language, and safety and security gives you the best chance to do that. It's also true that when you find out you're not good at certain things, it's not a tragedy the way it would be otherwise. You've got friends, you're good at language, you feel safe and secure at the world. So I'm a crappy piano player. I can't sing, I can't dance. Big deal. But if you were bad at relationships and bad at language and you didn't feel safe and secure in the world, being a bad singer or bad at music, or being a poor dancer, not the best athlete, might be tragic. You might have a hard time reminding yourself of the things you are good at. You may not feel like you're good at anything. You may develop a lot of shame. You may develop shame fatigue. And knowledge, we need to know things. We need to know things. You know, a big shout out to an important recent book, The Knowledge Gap. People need to know things. And some knowledge is more valuable than others. There's a certain common bond of knowledge that it helps for us all to share, to all have. That bonds us together and helps us to have relationships and understand each other better. We have to know things. These are all the things you use to build a life, because that's what we're doing. We have this developmental machine that's grinding forward, that's helping us to shape us to build a life. It's driving us and we're driving it. All this is going on in this mutual relationship between us and the world, trying to bring us forward. This is something I wrote. Reading is a technology which expands the evolved basis of language beyond the immediate environment, lets it reach other times, places, and people. It allows us to be in relationship with people we have never met and consider the motivations of characters who never existed except on paper, to learn about places and things we have never seen, and to exercise the deepest mental skills at our own pace, in our own time, according to our own needs. Reading is like the extra super pinnacle, the added on, the advanced level of language, because it lets us do these things. Reading is a technology that allows us to record thoughts. It also allows us to edit our thoughts for others. I'm speaking to you right now, and I have no way of going back and editing what I say. I would speak better and more clearly if I could write it all down in advance. Reading and writing give us a chance to do this. It gives us a chance to send a communication to people, to reconsider it, to modify it, to make it better. All of these deep frontal lobe activities to make it better, to think about how they would respond to it. How is it going to affect them? Is this going to have the effect that I want? We can do that more precisely in writing than we can in oral communication. Furthermore, when we deliver it to somebody, they can hold it, they can read it when they want to. They can read it again and again. They can go over it more than once in a way that you can't with oral language unless it's recorded in some way. Reading is a technology which expands the evolved basis of language beyond the immediate environment. Reading lets us explore situations, explore motivations, to engage that default network and what a character might do or why they might do it. It allows us to exercise relationships. It allows us to become skilled at relationships in a controlled way without actually having relationships. When you grow up, all of us have asked some child or somebody at some point in their life, what do you want to be when you grow up? How do you hope your life turns out? What do you want? The essence of that question is asking you to look into the future and imagine what your life is going to be like. When you're 5 or 6 or 7 years old, your ability to do that is fairly limited. Your ability to accurately identify the future is limited, which is a blessing when you're young because you can imagine anything you want. You can be like that 5-year-old girl who says, I'm going to be a mermaid. There's no need to tell her there's no such thing as mermaids. It doesn't matter. She's 5. It's a cute answer. Just a moment. Children are not encumbered by reality in the way older teenagers are. Children can imagine things for themselves that really aren't going to come true. They can hold on to those things and believe in those things, and that's wonderful and absolutely appropriate. But things change at some point. You know, I saw a boy one time, 7 years old, asked him what he wanted to do with his life. He said he wanted to be LeBron James. I didn't have the heart to tell him that job was taken. He doesn't get to be LeBron James. But I knew what he meant. He wanted to be a professional basketball player. He wanted to be the best basketball player in the world. Now, the funny thing was, at 7 years old, he might have been the worst 7-year-old basketball player you had ever seen. If he dribbled the ball more than once and it touched his hand when it came up, that was pretty good for him. He'd never make a shot. Nobody wanted him on their team, but it didn't matter because he was 7 years old and he wanted to be LeBron James. But something happens later on. The nature of that question changes as kids grow older. The question is different when you're 15 than when you're 5. It's probably different when you're 13 or 14. At some point, something changes, and it changes at the onset of puberty, the onset of adolescence. You know, we focus so much on the outward signs of adolescence, the growth spurt, the change in their body. They get hairy, they get smelly, they get irritable, they sleep at weird hours, they eat all the time. You don't want to be around them as much, maybe. They cry for no reason, they get angry for no reason. All these hormonal things that we miss. The really massive thing, the single most important thing that goes on in adolescence is there's a huge change in their brain. There's a massive explosion of brain development. It goes on everywhere, but mostly in the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes start turning on in really advanced ways. It won't be fully turned on for another decade yet, particularly if they're male. They won't get their full frontal lobe capacity for a while yet. There's this rapid development in frontal lobe capability. And one of the consequences of that is when you're 5, you can give any answer to this question you want. When you're 15, not only is the question different because it's probably not somebody asking you, it's you asking yourself. It's you reflecting on your life. It's you looking into the future of your life and imagining what's going to become of me. And the thing that happens because you've got this massive, talented, fantastic frontal lobe now is the answer you give about your future has to match up with the past that lies behind you. You can't say, I'm going to be LeBron James if you've been picked last for every team. You can't say you're going to be an astronaut if you get bad grades in science and math. You can't say you're going to be a singer or a dancer if people have always told you you don't sing and dance well. You can do that when you're 5 or 6. You can't do that when you're 14 or 15. Because when you ask yourself this question, your frontal lobe demands of you that you give an answer that fits reality, that you imagine for yourself a future that fits your past. Now, here's the thing. If your development has gone well, if your life has gone well, as you look back over your life, you'll see good things and bad things, things you feel good about, things you feel bad about, things that make you feel prideful, things that make you feel ashamed. But as long as there's enough good back there that you can honestly say to yourself, I'm not sure exactly where my future lies, but I think it'll be all right. I think I can feel good about it. Then you're okay. You know, when I was 13, 14, or 15 years old, if somebody asked me what I was going to do with my life, I certainly wouldn't have said I was going to be a psychologist. I'm not sure what my answer would have been, but I wouldn't have said psychologist. Yet here I am as a psychologist. But my honest answer would be, based on the way my life is gone, I think my future will be okay. But what if you look back and what you see does not give you confidence in your future? What if what you see does not convince you that your future will be bright, that your future will be at least okay? That's a crisis. It's a deep, profound, existential crisis that it can occur in childhood. And one of the things that contributes the most to that belief that the future may not be okay is if you have difficulties with literacy. If you go to school 7.5, 8 hours a day, where reading is absolutely essential, and reading does not go well for you, and nobody helps you, and you have no reason to believe it's going to get better, it's very difficult to imagine that your future is going to be bright. You see the odds going down all the time. I want to tell you a story now about a little girl. She's not a little girl anymore. She'd have to be in her, if I'm doing the math right, she'd be in her mid to late 30s at this point, wherever she is. I think about her often. She was 8 years old the first time I met her. I was working in the inpatient service back then, something we don't do nearly as much of anymore. That's the way we treated severe situations back then. She'd been brought to inpatient because she was living with her aunt. And one day, for no apparent reason, she got out a scissors and she stabbed the aunt's cat to death. She denied doing it, and I think she probably didn't remember doing it. But she killed the cat, scared the hell out of people. one of the first questions you ask is, how does this little girl, this sweet little girl, this very bright, precocious little girl, end up stabbing a cat? And you find out pretty quickly that she had a very, very, very traumatic history. I will not inflict on you the details of what happened to her, but suffice it to say, it is the stuff of nightmares. She had come to live with her aunt after she lived with her grandmother, after she lived with her mother. She'd been taken along with her brothers away from her mother's care because of the things that were going on when those things were discovered. She'd been placed with her grandmother, which was a bad decision because the mother was the way she was because of the grandmother. They eventually got her to an aunt who was completely separate and estranged from her sister and her mother and was living a much healthier life. She got to that aunt, but it was a little too late. I got to know her very well. I remember her still very well. She was deeply traumatized. She would dissociate. She would go into trance-like states where she would just stare for 45 minutes or an hour and you couldn't get her attention. She's a wonderful, intriguing, engaging little girl who was surprisingly good at forming at least superficial relationships with people, which told me that she had had some period of decent upbringing before the trauma began. And the trauma was related to the fact that her mother was a drug dealer, and to pay for the drugs, she traded what she had to men who were interested in exchange for drugs. As a result of that, this girl was never allowed to leave the apartment or the house where they lived. She was always there so that she could be traded for drugs, and many horrendous things happened to her. When she got to her aunt's house, she had never attended school a day in her life. The school district was unaware of her. Her brothers, one older, one younger, had been allowed to go to school because they weren't worth as much to the mother and what she did. But this little girl was not allowed to go to school. So imagine my surprise when at 8 years old, this girl who had never attended school, had been raised to this extraordinary level of trauma, was a beautiful, gifted reader. It seemed impossible. She could read anything. And don't mistake this. The number one reason she was a gifted reader is she was one of those kids with that perfect language brain. You know, my daughter was 4 years old and had learned to read just from being in the world mostly, and the little bit of lessons that we offered her. She had one of these greasy, quick magic brains that just picks it up. Very few kids are like that. Those kids' brains learn to read exactly the same way everybody else's brains do. They just do it on their own, do it very quickly. They read phonetically, they're not whole word readers. They don't skip over any steps that anybody else goes through. They just move through the steps so quickly, it appears that they skip them. You get a bad impression of reading and how reading develops if those are the kids we think about. But this was a little girl who was like that. It was extraordinary. But the other thing she had going for herself is that starting when she was 4 years old, and her brother was 6 and going to first grade, having a sense of what his sister was going through when she was home all day and he was in school, he would come home every day and do the best he could to teach her what he had learned in school that day. He would bring his books home, he would go to her room, he would talk to her, he would love her, he would be kind to her. He would bring her things, he would share his books with her, and as best he could, and he was also quite bright, he would teach her as much as he could that he had learned that day in school. Then the next day, he would repeat the same thing. That's how she learned to read. Because she could read, she could disappear into books. She could disappear into fantasy more than she should have, but she could do it, and it saved her. She couldn't go back to her aunt's house, so she went to a foster home. An older woman who was very kind to her and eventually adopted her. This older woman noticed that around town, when they would go to stores or go over every place, there was no place she could go with this girl. That something she saw, something wouldn't prompt a memory. She believed she saw her father or other men every place she went. She was afraid to go in places because it was a place she had been previously with them. So she was afraid to go. And the mother, this foster mother who would later adopt her, was so kind and so loving. She sold her house. and moved to a new, strange community where she had no ties, just to give this girl a fresh start. The story is not entirely glorious. As an adult, she has very few close relationships. She's still damaged by what happened to her. Despite her brother's love for her, they are not close because other things also went on between them that make their relationship enormously complicated. But she is successful. She has a very high security clearance with the United States military and the United States government. She supports herself. She is safe. She is not routinely hurt. She has developed a way of living in the world that gives her purpose. She has no serious ongoing relationships and probably never will. She will never have children for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that she recognizes it would be a bad idea. I saw her when she was 15 or 16 years old. I had a chance to see her again, and she remembered me, and we reminisced about all our time together. She leaned over and she told me a secret. She said, I want to tell you something. She says, I talk to you all the time. Our relationship had been important enough to her that she had internalized it well enough that during her translate states, which still occurred, she would imagine that I was there and that we were doing therapy together. That's the power of relationships, the power of reading, the power of language. Because she was blessed with this brain and blessed with this ability to acquire language and blessed with a brother who did what he did, she was able to acquire reading. And in spite of that, in spite of the extraordinary trauma that she endured, she was able to still see a positive life for herself. Kids like that are exceptionally rare. It's the reason this story is so moving. It's much more likely that kids who suffer trauma will struggle to see a future for themselves, will struggle to make a way for themselves in the world. Given everything that's happening in the world, it's essential now that we pause for a moment and reflect on what role poverty and racism, systemic racism and direct racism, play in this equation. Poverty is trauma. Make no mistake about it. To be poor is traumatic. There may have been a time and a place where being poor was not as traumatic as it is now, but being poor not only increases the likelihood that you will experience certain other traumas, like food anxiety and housing anxiety, that you will move more often, that you will have your relationship shattered, that you will go to multiple schools during your life and have your relationships to teachers and friends severed. But the poverty itself is a trauma. It's a message from society that says, you're not good enough. You don't meet the cut. You don't meet the standard. You're not good enough. My father is the 8th of 10 children, or the 10th of 12, depending on how you count. The first two passed away when they were quite young, and he never knew them. But in his life, he was the 8th of 10 children in a large, very poor family. He said something very interesting about that to me a number of years ago. He said, we were poor. Everybody we knew was poor, but I don't think we knew it. And then he reflected on what it must be like to be poor today. He said, it's got to be different to be poor today. The television, and the media, and the internet, and social media, and advertising, you'd know you were poor. You'd know it all the time. He said, that must be really terrible. Poverty is trauma, and racism is violence. Racism is a violent act. It's a judgment on a person based on a characteristic that they cannot change, that is unfair. Racism hangs over the heads of the victims of it all the time. A young man years ago, when I was doing outpatient work, came to see me, referred by the district attorney's office. I used to set a couple hours to see these kids because I was afraid they were never going to come back. Most of them didn't. So if I could only see him once, I was going to see him for a good long time and see if I could get anything accomplished. I was talking to this kid. He was a hard kid. He was an edgy kid, black kid, 17, 18 years old. I don't remember what he did that got him involved with the district attorney. But I remember one thing. I eventually got him around where we were relating to each other honestly enough, and I asked him a question. I said, so what's the worst thing? I knew a lot of bad things that happened to him. And I said, what was the worst thing that ever happened to you? And he didn't pick any of the things we had talked about. told me a story about walking down the sidewalk on a bright spring day, a bright summer day, full daylight, walking down the sidewalk, moving quickly the way young men do. And he passed a woman wheeling a baby in a stroller. And he didn't notice that she was becoming anxious as he approached. He wasn't paying attention to that. And as he got close to her, she cowered down, holding on to the stroller, and offered him her purse if he wouldn't kill her child. For all the things that had happened to him, that was the worst thing. And here's how he put it. He says, what do I do about people who are afraid of me, who've never even met me? What do I do about that? I didn't have an answer for him, and I don't have an answer for him now. Poverty is trauma, and racism is violence. That's the quote from my father. I guess we were poor, but everybody was poor, and we didn't know it. If you're poor nowadays, everybody knows it. The other thing we have to reflect on is epigenetics and generational trauma. So the model we have for genetics, the way most of us think of genetics, is you inherit a thing, you inherit a gene, and you get the trait, you have the thing. Most genetics don't work that way. It's not like eye color or whether Gregor Mendel's peas and whether the surface of the pea is smooth or wrinkled. It's not like blood typing. What you inherit is a propensity, a risk for something, a tendency for something to be true or not true about you. And this is influenced by usually many genes, not one gene. We think of disorders and genetic inheritability of conditions as one gene equals one trait. It's usually lots of genes that influence one trait. Each of those genes either increase or decrease the likelihood of that. And then there's epigenetics. The way genes, for all the genes you have, not all the genes are turned on, not all the genes are turned off. And one of the things you inherit from your parents is not only the genes, but which genes are going to be more active and which genes are going to be more expressive. The genes don't change, but it's like they get moved up towards the front of the list. They become more influential. The genes are turned on more of the time. Another gene is turned off more of the time. You inherit that as well. And trauma and racism change the equation of which genes are turned on and which genes are not. The stress and the trauma of racism and poverty changes that genetics, that epigenetics of our parents, and is inherited by their children. So it is literally possible that people suffer genetically, epigenetically, from the trauma and racism and poverty that was inflicted on previous generations. It's not that people can't recover from that, but it changes the equation. It tilts the scales against them. It starts out putting a bad thumb on the scale. It causes them to live a life that's slightly uphill, just naturally uphill compared to the rest of us. You cannot separate poverty and racism from the things we are talking about. We must confront these issues. We must confront the fact that the children we serve who suffer under poverty and racism, often generational poverty and racism, are affected unfairly by our failures to do what needs to be done. And one of the ways they're affected is that they're more likely to be illiterate. They're exposed to fewer words. It's not just the ability to read and not read. They're just exposed to fewer words. One of the things that happens in poverty and racism is it just stresses people out so much. Stressed people don't talk with their children as much, don't talk the same way. It leads to the word gap, Hart and Risley's word gap. That's how it happens. That's the vector by which trauma and racism influence the development of children, influence the language development of children. They don't hear as many words, they don't hear the same words constructed in the same way, and they pay an extraordinary price for it. It also makes it harder to believe in your future when you're 15. I'm going to tell you another story. Back when I was doing outpatient work, another one of those young men who was referred to me by the DA's office came to my office. He was 16 years old and he was huge. I don't know how big he was, but he was enormous. I'm 6'2", I weigh about 185 pounds. He was way bigger than me in every dimension. He was taller than me. He was heavier than me. He was stronger than me. He came to see me in August. And I watched him out the window outside of our clinic. We were up on a floor. I saw him come in, got out of the back seat of a car where he was hiding under a blanket because our office was in a neighborhood where it was unsafe for him to go because of his gang affiliation. And he came up to see me in my office, and I got him in very quickly. And again, I had 2 hours set aside for him. And he's wearing a long coat, a long, heavy coat on a hot summer day. And I got scared because I believe, and I still believe, that one reason he was wearing that coat was to cover up the weapons that he was likely carrying in case something happened. But he came to see me anyway, and we talked. And I asked him, so tell me, how do you see your life going? What do you want to be when you grow up? I probably didn't word it that way, but I asked him that question. And he said he wanted to be a drug dealer. I'd never gotten that answer before. He said he wanted to be a drug dealer. I said, why do you want to be a drug dealer? He said, because drug dealers make a lot of money. Okay. So I remembered that answer. We kept talking. We got into the second hour and things went on longer and longer. He got tired. I got tired. His guard went down. I got more natural. We were starting to form a little bit of a relationship. I said, tell me again. I learned things about him. I learned that he used to be a good student in school. I learned a little bit about what he was interested in. We started forming a relationship. I came back to that question. I said, tell me again what you want to be when you grow up. He said, I told you, man, I want to be a drug dealer. I said, yeah. What did you used to want to be before you wanted to be a drug dealer? And he paused, and he looked at me, and this tremendous look of sadness came over his face. And he started tilting his head back, lightly pounding it into the wall behind him. And tears rolled down his face. And he said he wanted to be a doctor. Picking up on what he said about wanting to be a drug dealer, I said, yeah, like drug dealers, they make a lot of money. And he tilted forward in a loud voice because he was angry with me. He said, no, it's not because they make a lot of money. Doctors, note the language, doctors get to help people. But now that's never going to happen. They're never going to let me be a doctor after everything I've done. At 16 years old, he had already lost his dream. He had enough that had gone on behind him that he did not believe that that future was possible for him. As we talked about it more, I learned that he had given up the dream of being a doctor when he was 12. Not because he didn't do well enough in school, but because so many other things had happened to him, and he had done so many things he felt ashamed of, and so many people had judged him, and he felt so downtrodden by poverty and racism that he didn't believe that that future was possible anymore. It's not okay that we work so hard in schools and in education and the way we teach children to read, to give them a sense of hope for the future, and to infuse in them dreams of purpose in their lives, only to take it away when they leave the room, only to take it away in another part of their day, in another part of their life. That is not okay. Closing the gap in the lessons of Head Start. You know, one of the things that comes up in the reading world and the education world all the time is, how are we going to close the achievement gap? I have some good news for you and some bad news for you. I'm not going to say whether you count as good news or bad news. The good news and the bad news is you're not going to change the achievement gap. You're not going to close it. I don't believe you can do it. It's not within your power. You'll do your part. But the achievement gap between black and white students, between privileged and unprivileged, underprivileged students, is not going to close right now because of anything you do. It may close in 100 years or 150 years. It may get smaller because of something we do as a nation if we have that kind of courage. But the gap is there. And if you teach differently, the gap will still be there. If you teach better, the gap will still be there. What will change if you teach better is instead of the gap being here, the gap will be here. Everybody will go up. Everybody will benefit. The gap will stay the same. The Head Start reference I have here is when Head Start began. The hope was to close the gap in school readiness between privileged and underprivileged children. They hoped that if they sent little white kids and little black kids to Head Start together, and there was a difference in their social and developmental readiness for school when they got there, by the time they got out of Head Start, that gap would have closed. What happened was the gap stayed the same and actually got slightly larger because everybody was now more ready for school. This was seen by some people as a failure, that we had not closed the gap. There's another way of looking at it and saying, if I can't close the gap, I'm at least going to shift the gap from here to here. If I'm going to fight with the gap, if we're going to have to live with the gap for another 50 or 100 or 150 years, however long it's going to take, if we're going to have to live with the gap, let's live with this gap. Let's not live with this one. So I get frustrated sometimes when schools and agencies and governments pay, I think, uninformed attention to the achievement gaps. Those achievement gaps are going to be there. We have no way of erasing in school what poverty and racism does to people outside of school and across society. We have no way to erase that. But if you teach in a better way, if you teach in a way that matches the way brains read from back to front, not front to back, that we identify letters which clue us into sounds, and let us identify words, and then identify meaning, more kids will learn to read and read better, and the gap will move up. This has been demonstrated by some accidental studies that have been done. We can compare states like Massachusetts, Florida, and Mississippi that have made dramatic changes, districts like Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Kennewick, Washington, others that have made dramatic changes in the way they teach reading. What we see is reforms in reading instruction, scientific reforms in reading instruction, which were intended to raise the kids at the bottom, instead raised everybody. In Massachusetts, Florida, Delaware, District of Columbia, Mississippi, schools of the Defense Department that have done these things, if you look at their performance on the National Assessment of Educational Progress over time, what you see is the number of kids at the lowest level decreases. Those kids move up. But the number of kids at the highest level move up too. Those weren't kids who were below basic who are now at advanced. Those are kids who are at proficient who are now at advanced. Those are kids who would have been proficient under the other way of teaching reading, who are now reading at an advanced level, using the same reforms and the same methods that raised another kid from below basic to basic. That's an extraordinary thing. And that's a reminder of how developmental this is, that this is universal, that what kids need isn't so different from one kid to another. There aren't kids who need one way of learning to read and other kids who need another way of learning to read. They may need a different pace of learning to read. They may need more detail and instruction. They may travel the path of reading faster or slower, but they're all going to travel the same path. They're all going to benefit from the same reforms. We don't have to worry that what we're doing for the poor kids or the disadvantaged kids is going to hold the advanced kids back. We're not going to hold the advanced kids back. They're going to benefit from this too. Where can we intervene? Where can we intervene in the lives of children? Most kids begin with adequate safety and security, though some are damaged by trauma later. So we can reduce trauma and build resilience, but that's really hard. You don't have enough control and authority. You don't pull enough of the levers. You don't have enough detailed, intimate control of what goes on in the world to reduce trauma that much and build resilience that much. Not right now. You can't do it today. We all work for it. We all march for it, I hope. But it's going to take time. Relationships are difficult to promote directly. You can try to get other kids to be friendly to that kid, but I bet it's not going to work very often. When the kid goes home, the quality of the relationships may still be poor. People may still not love and care for them the way they need to. They may not be well treated in their home or in their neighborhood. So we give them the relationships we can, but there's only so much we can do. But language can be directly influenced. We can teach better. We can teach more effectively. Of the 3 foundational elements of development, relationships, safety and security, and language, it's language that's the most under control. I can shower you with language. I can bury you under language. I can expose you to language. I can do a better job of teaching you to read. I can give you access to language, and nobody can take it away from you. It cannot be taken away by somebody else. And we have this vast infrastructure of media and schools and teachers and universities and books to infuse language into kids. This is the place we can intervene most effectively. That's why it is essential that when we have a child in front of us available to teach them to read and available to expose them to language, that we do that the most effectively we possibly can. Not just so that they become a better reader, but so they become a better person. So they are more invulnerable to the insults of the world. So that language and those experiences and that knowledge protect them as much as it can against the poverty and the racism and the hatred that some of them are going to encounter. We also have to offer wonder, magic, and success. Kids need a chance to be good at things. They need a chance to do the things they're good at. The worst thing we do to children, and we mostly do this to boys, is we find out what they love the most, what they're the best at, what makes them the happiest. Then we threaten to take it away from them unless they do something we want them to do. Unless you get a better grade in math on your next test, no video games. Unless you get a better grade, I'm going to kick you off the basketball team. It's cruel. It's heartless. I used my relationship with you to find out the thing you love the most. Then I used it against you. So the interventional model of human development, language sits at the bottom. Language is the essential foundation because language is the thing we can do the most about, the thing on which we can have the most direct influence. And into this space we deliver wonder. I believe dramatically, I believe passionately in kids having lots and lots and lots of ungraded, wonderful experiences. That they have a chance to explore things in a way that we don't test, that they have a chance to experience things in a way that they're not held accountable for, that we experience them simply for the benefit of the wonder and the magic. You know, I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Lake Michigan is a few miles in that direction. There are children between me and Lake Michigan who have never seen Lake Michigan. They've never felt how cold it is in July and August, still in July and August. They don't know that the lake is there. They don't know how big it is because they are not exposed to their world. Kids who go on field trips, one time in elementary school, they go on a field trip to the zoo. If I was running a school, I'd find the money. Every kid in that school would go to the zoo 2, 3, 4 times a year. My kids went to the zoo all the time. They have to see the magic and the wonder of the world. They have to get a chance to explore things. One of the things I was encouraging people to do during quarantine was to make sure that their kids had chances to explore things that really interested them. If you're really interested in geology, go learn a lot about geology. If you're really interested in butterflies, learn a lot about butterflies. If you're really interested in photography, study photography, do photography, share it with people. The things that are magical to you. And they have to be successful. I worry about kids who have nothing that they're overtly good at, nothing that makes them feel good about themselves, nothing that they're one day going to be able to look back on and say, you know, I was bad at a lot of things, but I was good at that. I was good at that, and I'm still good at that, and people know I'm good at that. Everybody needs a few of those things in their life. They need them in a way that we don't take away from them. Some of you may be familiar with this guy's name, Don Meichenbaum. So Don Meichenbaum is the originator of cognitive behavioral therapy. That's a big deal. He's one of the 2 people credited with the development of cognitive behavioral therapy. He's the person who coined the term. Don is also a friend of mine. the end of the 20th century, they surveyed mental health providers and say, who are the most important, influential mental health practitioners, mental health people of the 20th century? Don Meichenbaum made the list of the top 10. That's how important Don Meichenbaum is. Don Meichenbaum at a conference I attended on trauma, which lasted a week. On Friday, we got around to trauma in children and said the most important thing you can do for a young child who's experienced trauma, the best thing to do for them is teach them to read. Teach them to read. My mouth hung open. I dropped my pen. I was sitting in the front row. He knew my name. And he said, Steve, why does this surprise you? I said, I never thought I would hear you say that. I thought you were going to talk about some kind of therapy. He says, they can get therapy later. It's hard to do therapy with traumatized 6-year-olds and 8-year-olds. Well, how are you going to do therapy with them? It's going to take them a lifetime to survive their trauma. But if they've been traumatized in their life, and then they go to school and they don't learn to read, every day they go to school is going to be hell for them. So home is hell, and school is hell. What chance do they have? Their only chance is to do well enough at school to learn to read for all the reasons we've discussed, so that that can keep them afloat, keep them alive, keep their head above water, be filling the backstory of their life with some decent things until they're capable of doing enough therapy, of growing enough, of evolving enough, managing enough that they can get over the trauma that they've had. If you've been traumatized and you can't read, you're screwed. If you're poor and stressed and can't read, you're screwed. If you're the victim of racism and you can't read, you're screwed. If you've got one strike against you, if you've got one thing that's weighing you down, if you've got one thing that's burdening you and stressing you, if you've got one dark thing that keeps popping up over and over again behind you in the story of your life, and you can't read, you're in a lot of trouble. Reading is the great vaccine. The ability to read and what it does for language and what it does for relationships is the great vaccine. Reading and learning to read well builds and extends language. It refines the brain. It develops and repairs the brain. It helps us recover from other injuries and insults, from other failures, from other stresses and traumas. It builds the default network. You know, the default network has to do with relationships. You can read a book and have a relationship with Harry Potter. You can read a book and have a relationship with the characters from Little Women. You can read Little House of the Prairie and be transported back to a different time. You can explore the way other people's lives go and have a window into their thoughts and emotions, even though those people never really existed and you're never going to meet them. That builds the default network. It helps you understand other people better. You have a chance to know who Atticus Finch was, and Scout, and Jem. You have a chance to be exposed to the heroism of Boo Radley. Reading and learning to read well fosters resilience. It gives you something behind you that you can say, yeah, maybe I'm not so good at this. Maybe it's bad today. But I believe my future will be better. I believe my future will be brighter. I can pick myself up and keep going. Learning to read benefits everyone and harms no one. More importantly, teaching reading well based on the science of reading, based on the knowledge of what we understand about phonetics and phonology. Teaching reading in a way that helps kids identify words and the way the brain works, from letters to sounds to words to meaning, refines the brain. It benefits everyone and harms no one. The fact that some kids learn to read when we teach a different way isn't that they learn to read because we teach that way. They learn to read in spite of that way. Poor kids, traumatized kids, stressed kids, kids who are victims of racism cannot learn to read unless we give it our best effort. They will not rise above our poor effort. They will not make up for our mistakes. Rich little greasy, quick, smart brain, you know, untraumatized, unstressed kids like my daughter. She got some of the worst reading instruction in the world. It didn't matter. If she had come from a different circumstance, it would have mattered. It improves the odds for everything, good thing, both by building that developmental bucket and helping to fill it. And literacy is justice. Literacy is justice. Unlike poverty, we know what to do about literacy. Unlike racism, we know what to do about literacy. It isn't easy, oh God. It isn't easy, but we know what to do. Jesus said the poor will always be with you, and that may be true. But the illiterate need not always be with us. We can eliminate that. We can do something about that. We have the knowledge. We have the money. We lack the resolve. We lack the courage. We lack the resolve. My hope is in this current day that if we can see not just teaching reading and literacy, but teaching it well, teaching it the right way, having the courage to see that we haven't always done the best things. It's seeing that that is a social justice issue because it affects poor kids and black kids more than white kids. White kids may be able to overcome bad teaching. Poor kids and black kids cannot. The last story, I want to leave you with this, and then I want to take some time, see if there's any questions people have. This story will only take me a few minutes. About a young man I met on the inpatient service first when he was 12 years old. He's an African-American kid who had some interesting physical and cosmetic features that caused him to be teased. That's not why he was in the hospital. He was in the hospital because he was filled with rage. He was filled with rage because of what had gone on in his family when he was born. When he was 6 or 7 years old, he was removed from their care. They terminated parental rights. Between that time and when he was 12, he bounced from foster home to group home to foster home to group home. When I saw him in the inpatient service, he had been brought there because the day before at school, a 14-year-old boy who was much bigger than he was teasing him in the cafeteria. And my young man was using all the skills he had been taught to resist that, to not overreact, to not let his temper get the best of him. And this kid who maybe had gotten a rise out of him before couldn't get a rise out of him this time. After hitting him in the back of the head one last time, he walked away and he said something as he walked away. That's okay, you can't do nothing about it anyway. And that got to my guy. Because when he was a little kid, seeing the things that happened to his brothers and sisters and half-brothers and half-sisters, the things that went on in his house, the things that were done to him and to other people in the family, he couldn't do anything about it back then. But he could do something about it now. So filled with rage over the idea that he was still inept, that he was still incapable of doing anything about this injustice, he leaped out of his seat and attacked this young man, knocked him to the ground almost instantly. This kid was bigger and stronger than he was, but he didn't have the rage my young guy had. 12 years old, he pummeled him in the face. Police reports said they pulled him off in 10 to 15 seconds. In that amount of time, this scrawny little 12-year-old had broken every bone in this kid's face. The kid needed repeated reconstructive surgeries to put his face back together. That's how much rage this young man had. And I got to know him, and you could feel the rage oozing off him. It's like if you got too close to him, you could feel heat. We would do things together. We would play pool, we would play cards, we would walk, we would talk. I never felt like we were particularly close. He was closed, he was tight. It was hard to get near him. Always wondered how much of a relationship we had. At some point I asked him what he wanted to do with his life, what he saw himself doing. He says, oh, I know what I'm gonna do. What? What do you think you're gonna do? He says, well, someday I'm gonna find my parents, I'm gonna go back to them. You hear that a lot from kids who've been separated from their parents. They want to find them. No matter what happened, they forgive, they want to find them. I said, what would that be like? He says, I want to find them, and then I'm going to kill them. He was 12 years old, and the one thing he was absolutely sure he wanted in his future, the one thing he got from his past, was that he wanted to reach back and find those two people and murder them. It was absolutely clear to him, and when he said it, my blood ran cold. He left the hospital. I heard about him a little bit, but I didn't see him much. I lost track of him. 2 years later, he was 14 years old. And I saw him at the detention center where I was evaluating another kid. And he walked by me along the other side of the room in a line of boys, and I recognized him right away. He had those physical features that made him quite noticeable. And I came back the next day and I got it. I sent for him and they brought him for me to see him. I said I was there for a professional visit. It was really just because I wanted to catch up with him and hear what he was doing and find out why he was in detention. I asked if he remembered me. I felt we didn't have much of a relationship. I asked if he remembered me. He was offended. Of course I remembered him. He was offended that I would think that maybe he didn't remember me. Then I asked him why he was in detention. What happened? Why are you here? He said, oh, I found my parents. The blood started to drain from my head. I honestly felt like I was going to pass out. I felt nauseous. My vision started to close in from the sides. I broke out in a sweat. I gathered myself and I said, tell me about that. He said, oh, I was living in a foster home. As luck would have it, his parents were in the neighborhood. Nobody checked. They lived just a few blocks away. So he saw them one day. They didn't see him. He figured out where they lived. One night, in the middle of the night, he gathered up a few of his belongings. He didn't have very much. He left the foster home. He went to the door and they knocked and they let him in because they didn't know why he was there. And he stayed with them a few days, maybe a week, learning their habits, what was going on, getting the lay of land in the house. And one night, while they were asleep, he got up, went to the kitchen, got out the biggest, longest, sharpest, pointiest knife they had. And he went to their room. And he walked around their bed where they were both asleep. They might have been drunk. And he told me about it. He said, I thought about stabbing my mother first because she was small and she'd be easy to kill. I could kill her with a couple of stabs. That would have been easy. But my dad's a big guy. If I killed her, it would probably wake him up. And if he got up, I don't know if I could get him. Even with a knife, I don't know if I could kill him. So I can't stab her first. So he walks around to the other side of the bed and gets ready to stab his dad. And he thinks, I'm going to have to stab him a lot. He is not going to die easy. There's going to be a fight. I think I can get him. But while I get him, she's going to wake up. And there's a phone on her side of the bed. If she calls 911, I'm going to be in trouble. And I don't want to get caught. I said, so what happened? So I put the knife away. And I walked to the police station, District 4 police station in Milwaukee in Silver Spring. I walked to the police station and I turned myself in. 2:30 in the morning, this kid comes walking in and reports himself as missing. He was on the list of missing kids and there was a warrant out for him because he had failed to attend a court hearing that reviewed his ongoing foster child status. That's the only reason there was a warrant out for him. It's the only reason he was in detention. He hadn't killed anybody. So the blood returned to my head and I stopped sweating and I tried not to smile too widely. I said, why didn't you do it? I remember you talked about it, you used to talk about it. You'd tell me that was the one thing you wanted to do. I remembered that. He said, yeah. Why didn't you do it? You had your chance. And he held up his hands like this, 4 fingers on each hand with his thumbs curled up. He said, because there's 8 people in the world that if I killed my parents, I'd let them down. And I don't want to let them down. 8 people in the world that he had a strong enough relationship that he didn't want to let those people down. I said, who are they? The first person he named was Dr. Dennis Kozel, his child psychiatrist. A friend of mine and a wonderful man and absolutely deserved to be on that list. Second person he named was me. I wondered when I worked with him if we had a relationship. It turned out our relationship was strong enough that he didn't kill 2 people because of me. He was worried enough about my opinion of him that he gave up his dream of killing these 2 people who deserved to die, by the way, though he did not deserve to be a killer. The other 6 people he named were all teachers. The other 6 people he named were teachers who I dare say most of whom would have been as surprised as I was to be on the list. Well, I think if I could have found them, and I wish I had, would have been surprised to find out that they had touched him that deeply and that importantly. Teachers change lives, teachers save lives, teachers give hope, teachers build a background, in part by teaching kids to read, but by also loving them and having relationships to them. Give them something to look back on that helps them to believe in the future. Never underestimate that. Does anybody have any questions?
Well, Steve, I don't see anybody jumping in right now, but
I did have a question. I posted it, and it's based on, because I don't know. I really don't know. I'm really asking because, to preface it, my husband is teaching in a new district, a new school this year,
Right.
and he's struggling with the language that he hears on a continual basis because it involves a lot of cursing.
Right.
And so I was wondering, is there an impact if that dominates your language? Like if that becomes how you speak, is there an impact? Or do they not even recognize it as I mean, I'm just curious.
Right. So it depends. Are we talking about kids who are cursing because they're so filled with anger that these are angry words and they use angry words all the time? This reflects a deep sort of baseline status of anger and rage in their life. Then it's not that the cursing is the problem, but the cursing is an indication of this underlying level of baseline rage. For some kids, they speak that way because that's just the words they know. They just use those words casually, as some of us do sometimes. There's no anger in it. It may be objectionable to some of us. They may not know these other social norms. Where they come from, this may be normative language. And so it's important to get a sense of that. If these kids are cursing and using vulgar language primarily out of anger, that's of more concern to me than the other thing. But it's important that kids know that their language has an impact on other people and that some people are offended by this language. And I hope that over time you can use this language less, because I don't think you really want to offend or bother people. And you make it something that you can work on over time. They also need other words. They need to develop other language. They need other words that they can use. They're using the words that they know. Think how different it is for some kids who know these words so well at an early age that they use them regularly. And there are other kids across town who barely know these words. Think how different that upbringing must be.
Thank you.
Steve, thank you. We are going to take about a 45-minute break and try to come back around 12:30.
So I'm happy to be back. I hope everybody had a chance to take a break, stretch their legs. If it's sunny where you are, maybe get outside for a moment, have a little bit of a snack if that's what you want to do with your time. Stanley let me know when I got back that we had some good questions. And if there's any more questions, I encourage people to throw them in. This is the best time for us to sort of pull things together and answer some questions, make sure I get a chance as best I can to answer, to give you as good an answer as I can. So Stanley's going to start with one of the questions.
which area of the brain is most affected, impacted by psychosocial trauma?
So the area of the brain that's most closely associated with psychosocial trauma are areas of the brain not cortical. So when we talk about reading, we talk about some of these other functions. When we talk about the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe, we're talking about the cortex of the brain, the wrinkly surface on the top of the brain. Some of the areas of the brain that are most directly affected by psychosocial trauma are deeper, we could consider more basic, more foundational, more primitive structures of the brain, parts of the brain that we share in common. So the brain stem, which is very involved in self-preservation, the fight, flight, or freeze response is closely related to the brain stem, becomes more active, becomes hyper alert, becomes more and more ready to influence what's going on. It's not that it takes over. Sometimes people refer to it wrongly as hijacking the brain. It doesn't hijack anything, but there's a balance between all the different parts of the brain. A very complex. Think about it as like a 1,000-seat teeter-totter that's always balancing out the different things the brain does and different priorities. What happens is when you're exposed to a lot of psychosocial trauma, during psychosocial trauma, that brainstem, that survival mechanism gets louder, it starts to take over. If you think of a symphony with many instruments, that instrument starts to stand out. And that has a consequence for other parts of the brain. And as it stands out, If you were in the middle of an emergency, if you were in the middle of a house fire, that part of your brain would take over and would get you running and get you moving out of the house. But then it would recede more into, as you calm down, it would recede more into the background. What happens is when you're exposed to too much trauma too repetitively, that part of your brain becomes more active and more dominant, and it doesn't recede more into the background. It continues to hold on to a more dominant role than we would like most of the time. That's the direct impact. In the mid parts of the brain, the limbic system, there are parts of the brain that are responsible for filtering emotion and some other things, helping us to do a lot of sort of pre-sensory management, pre-conscious sensory management. And they become more active and more alert, more attuned to certain issues. And again, like the brainstem, they can remain more alert. They can become habitually more alert, sort of reset your baseline to sort of always being on guard, always being ready. The indirect consequences of that are that other parts of the brain get less attention, less energy, less blood flow, fewer calories. The brain devotes less of its limited resources to those parts of the brain. It's sort of like if you lived in a many-room house and you were putting lots of money into repairing your kitchen, there wouldn't be as much time or energy or resources to work on other parts of the brain. And it's the same thing with this. As resources are devoted towards establishing neural connections, pruning neural connections, think of that as like gardening, maintaining a healthy pattern of neural connections. So much energy, so much fat and calories and glia is being devoted towards these parts of the brain that there's less for everything else. So everything else gets ripped off a little bit. You know, and we particularly experience those impacts over time when trauma is chronic and unremitting and they don't get a chance to recover. It's important that we understand that this is a complex balancing act of the brain. It's not a question of either your brainstem is active or your frontal lobes are active. Both are active all the time, but the balance between them shifts. And if it shifts too much and it shifts too permanently, that can have profound consequences for the rest of your brain.
And speaking of those consequences, how does psychosocial trauma impact the development of children's language in light of stages of language development?
Well, obviously it affects you differently and if it affects you at different ages. It's going to have a different effect if the trauma really devastates you early when you're just originally starting to acquire language. It may also affect you if you are devastated by trauma at the onset of formal education and when you're supposed to be learning to read. You may have perfectly good oral language, and then a period of trauma develops in your life. And you really need the mental energy to devote to expanding into this brave new world of reading and writing. If you're preoccupied with trauma, again, it's the allocation of resources. You and your brain, your time, your energy just may not be there for these other things. The other thing that happens is people who are exposed to trauma and are likely to be exposed to trauma tend, as a rule, because of poverty, because of racism, because of the difference in our communities, to oftentimes be living in environments where other people around them are heavily exposed to trauma or have a strong history of trauma. And so they will be indirectly affected by that. If you have a parent or you live in a house with people who are very stressed, very traumatized, they talk to you less. And as a result, the parts of your brain that are responsible for words and understanding words don't get exercised as much. They don't get as much activity. They don't get as many resources. And at the cellular level, that's reflected in fewer of those neural connections, a lower quality of those neural connections, less neural mass in that area, less gray matter, less white matter, and myelin, which I expressed earlier. The most important neural pathways in our brains, the ones that the brain depends on and uses the most, those nerve cells get coated in nodes of a fatty white substance called myelin, which you can think of as like insulation on a wire. A nerve cell, a long fiber of nerve, an axon, can communicate an electrical message without being myelinated, but it's slow, it's inaccurate, it's more susceptible to interference. When it's coated with myelin, it moves faster, it moves more accurately, it's more dependable. And so myelin takes time. When we're born, not many of the nerve fibers in our brain are myelinated in our body. And our body starts to myelinate those, and it has to decide what are the most important ones. Where do I want to put this energy? And those are things that suffer in trauma and stress. The body makes a different allocation of resources. Now you can catch up on that. If we catch you early enough, if you haven't been exposed to a lot of language or you didn't absorb the language as well because of trauma, the language may have been around you, but you weren't soaking it up in the way you would because your brain was fixated on these traumatic experiences. We can have a catch-up period, but that period isn't going to be weeks or months. It's going to be years that we need to flood you with more and more and more and more language, really go overboard with language, to really flood you with that, to try to restore those areas. This also brings up the question of critical periods. We know that there are critical periods in the development of language. If you don't develop language by a certain age, it gets increasingly difficult to develop language. It's not impossible, but the window of opportunity for developing normal, healthy language, robust language, starts to decrease. In order to do it as you get older, it takes more and more effort to get the same results. It takes more and more time to get the same results. And the whole time you're trying to get a 10-year-old caught up on their language deficits and trying to get them caught up to 10, it's going to take you a long time. Meanwhile, the bar is moving. They're turning 11 and 12 and 13. So what can happen is you're trying to catch up, and really you're falling further and further behind. Once you get behind, it's very, very difficult in many of these things to get caught up. It's easiest to get caught up when we catch them very, very early. It's one of the reasons that the let's wait and see approach to early reading difficulties is so devastating. You see a kid who has difficulty learning to read, difficulty with phonological processing, and you think, well, maybe it'll just go away on its own. It probably won't, but let's wait and see. While you wait and see, they're falling further and further and further behind, and developmentally they're changing. Their brain is less plastic, it's less malleable. Think of it as like clay that's getting harder and harder. So it's harder, it's not only are they getting farther and farther behind, but it's getting harder and harder to accelerate them to get them caught up. So some of these changes we talk about are permanent, some of these changes are temporary, but the window of opportunity to make them temporary and ameliorate them is always closing. So striking while the iron is hot, getting in there sooner, being aggressive about it early is always very important.
Thank you so much for taking the time to address those questions. I will let you begin the rest of the presentation.
All right. So let me say again, I'm going to stop frequently during this, and if anybody who's screening the questions for me sees an interesting question, they should feel free to alert me at any time. This is a presentation that I really like to have more questions than answers. If I was doing this live, I would always be looking around the room, seeing if we had any input that people want to talk about. So we're going to start with a super quick, sometimes I do this presentation and I haven't done the other presentation immediately preceding, or not everybody has been there. They saw the presentation months ago or years ago.
I got a question for you already.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Does the neuroplasticity that allows neurons in the brain to compensate for injury and disease function the same with emotional trauma?
It's the same basic principle. And we have to talk a little bit about plasticity. Plasticity is both real and imagined. So the brain is plastic, and what we mean by that is, so if we go back, there was a debate at one point when we were first starting to develop these ideas of neural functioning and recognizing that different parts of the brain function and did different things. And then an injury in one part of the brain might affect you in a very specific way, and an injury in another part of the brain might affect you in a very different specific way. And this led to a debate between what was referred to as this sort of focal model of the brain, that each part of the brain did a very specific thing and it only did that thing. And on the other side was something that a guy named Lashley came up with, called equipotentiality. And equipotentiality means that every part of the brain had equal potential. The reality of the brain is that there's a balance between focal skills and equipotentiality, what we would refer to as plasticity. The brain is plastic, the brain can adapt. It adapts easier at an earlier age, but there's always a price for that adaptation. you don't get something for nothing. You don't get something for free. You don't lose part of your brain and have there's not some unused section of your brain that takes over for that. A part of your brain may take over for that, but it's sort of like if you lost a third of your house in a tornado, you might still be able to fit everybody else in the house, but there's going to be consequences to that. Some people are going to have to double up. We're not going to have as much room anymore. We're going to lose some of our furniture. The same thing when parts of the brain don't develop well and we have to have plasticity. There's a price for that. And remember, when you're learning something at 10 that we would have preferred you learned when you're 6, that means there's stuff you should have learned when you're 10 that you're not learning when you're 10. It's going to be put off till you're 11 or 12. There's always a price. There's always a consequence for this. It's sort of a principle of economics. You can't spend the same dollar twice. If your brain is doing certain things, that means there's other things it's not doing. If it's taking care of unfinished business, that means other things are being left unattended. While I'm doing this presentation with you, there's email I'm not returning that I'm going to have to get caught up on. At some point you pay the price. At some point there's just not enough resources, not enough time to get the brain completely caught up. The most dramatic examples of plasticity are children who are born. This is what Dr. Ben Carson became famous for, regardless of what you think of his politics. Ben Carson became the foremost practitioner of a terrifying surgery called a hemispherectomy. And these were kids who had really severe untreatable seizure disorders that wouldn't respond to any medication or anything else. And if they were young enough, he would remove half their cerebral cortex. So he would go in through a window in the skull and he would remove half of it. And when the kids woke up, they were hemiparetic. They were paralyzed on one side of their body. They had lost an enormous amount of skills and ability. But if you did it when they were young enough, their brain responded and relearned a lot of those things. They developed the ability to move again, and they were not nearly as paralyzed as they were before, but not without cost. You cannot injure the brain for free. You particularly cannot injure the brain over and over for free. So while plasticity is a wonderful thing, and it's great that we can heal and we can recover, we don't recover for free. There is a cost, and if you ask the brain to do it too many times, the cost gets very, very high. I hope that answered the question. So reading trauma and child development, further discussion. So we talked earlier about what is trauma. Trauma is injury. We talked about chronic versus acute injury. We talked about the impact of poverty as a source of trauma. We didn't talk a lot about response to treatment. The most important thing that people need to recover from trauma is a period of time absent of trauma. They need a chance to, most of the recovery from trauma is natural. The vast majority of people, even who have PTSD, if they have solid relationships, solid abilities, they have a good past behind them, will not particularly need super skilled extensive therapy to recover from even severe trauma. Given enough time, enough love, enough support, enough compassion, most people will recover pretty well. Does that mean they won't have PTSD anymore? No, it'll still be there. Somebody who knows how to look for it, knows how to interview for it, will still find the evidence of PTSD. But people will live with it effectively. They may go from not being able to leave the house or function to leaving the house and functioning well, but just avoiding certain places that aren't really that important anyway. They'll go from hiding in the basement and never coming out to going out in the world, but just avoiding loud crowds or wearing earphones or earplugs when they're in loud crowds. They've still got the PTSD. But the most important element, the most important thing to remember is the most important element of recovery and treatment is time. It's time. It's time with people who care about you, people who are kind to you, people who are pulling you forward instead of holding you back, people who are delivering relationships and language to you and doing those good things for your brain. There is no magic trick to recovering from trauma. There's a lot of charlatans out there who want to make it sound sort of magical and all that sort of thing. There's nothing magical about the therapy we do. It can be challenging, it can be difficult, it can be tedious. It's like teaching a very dyslexic child how to read, you have to keep it up over time, and it helps to be very skilled at it and very experienced at it. There's nothing magical about it. It's hard work. And it takes time. There's no shortcut. That's what we're talking about here, healing over time. Healing over time. The vast majority of people who have suffered even extraordinary traumas recover quite well, surprisingly well, so long as those traumas are not repeated, that they don't layer up. We don't get trauma upon trauma upon trauma upon trauma. That's when things get very difficult. That's when skilled therapy is most likely to be critically necessary, and yet only somewhat helpful. We have to be honest. Nobody's that good at therapy. Nobody's that good at unraveling these things, that they can solve these things every time. That's why Mike Inbound says the most, one of the foremost therapists of the last 100 years says the most important thing to do with kids who've been traumatized is not to put them in therapy, but to teach them how to read and help them go to school and let them be successful and let them have friends and get them living a happy, productive, for their age, successful life. It is disruptive to development, and we have to keep an eye on that. Trauma is very, very disruptive to development. It can impair development, it can interrupt development, and it can be hard to get development back on track. Kids have a remarkable ability, that plasticity, to catch up. But again, they don't catch up without a price. There's a cost to catching up. When you get behind, if you got behind in a race, you could run faster to catch up to the front, but when you get there now, you're breathing very heavy. You may not be able to stay. You may not be able to keep up, to stay with the pack anymore because you've exerted so much energy to catch up. You're paying a significant price. We're reminded of the 3 pillars of child development: safety and security, relationships, and language, which we covered extensively this morning. They're all interacting all the time. That's the most important thing to remember. That in healthy development, it's not like we're doing one or we're doing the other. If we're doing one, we're doing all of them. Language enhances relationships, relationships enhance language. Working on those things enhance a kid's sense of safety and security. And sometimes the best thing to do is to work on the others. If somebody's had their sense of safety and security violated, instead of getting in there and in detail and trying to very directly restore their sense of safety and security, talking about it ad nauseum, what can I do for you, trying to build safety and security around them in some way, surrounding them with guardians or something. Instead of doing something like that, the best thing to do is often to work on the other two, to enhance the other two, knowing that the child is going to be relying on those other 2 elements to help them while they heal and recover from this temporary insult, hopefully temporary, to their safety and security. That building language, building reading skills enhances safety and security and enhances relationships. We should work and influence where we can, not always feel like we have to go at things directly, because sometimes it's very difficult to go at them directly. So what this looks like, when it goes well, it's a beautiful thing. It's an amazing thing that kids can develop from the cradle to the grave, that they can learn to dance that mad dance as well as they do. It's extraordinary. People ask me, why isn't this child doing well in school? And sometimes they say, why are any children doing well in school? Why are any children doing well ever? It's really remarkable that as many kids do as well as they do. And thinking about that reminds us that all kids are at some risk. All kids are at risk that at any moment, at any time, things could start to go badly for them. But when it goes well, it's a beautiful thing. And it's natural. It's driven by, there's enough biology and evolution and genetics in it to keep pushing it forward. Brains thirst for language. We deny them language, we traumatize them too much. They stop thirsting for language. They thirst for relationships. We traumatize them too much, we hurt them too much, we give them too much failure. They may stop thirsting for relationships. They may stop thirsting for healthy relationships. One of the things that we notice all the time is that the difference between kids with brighter and more troubling futures the differences between them are smaller when they first start in school. But over time, those differences grow bigger and bigger because they're on different trajectories. And these small differences tend to get magnified over time. If we don't do anything about it, the tendency over time is that these differences, these gaps will not close on their own. They will tend to get larger. This is the nature, and many of you have heard of this, this is the nature of what's referred to as the Matthew effect. A ubiquitous force in sociology and social sciences, the Matthew effect, taken from a line paraphrased from the Gospel of Matthew, that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. What we're saying is, if you find somebody, think of it as in a foot race. If I check in the foot race and somebody is 5 yards ahead of somebody, if I check in an hour later, they're likely to be more ahead. Not always, but they're likely to be more ahead. Whoever's ahead, whoever's winning, the gap tends to get bigger over time. That's with behavior, that's with language, that's with relationships, that's with everything, that's with poverty, that's with everything. The situation does not tend to get better on its own. It takes concerted effort. And that's what happens when it starts to go poorly, is that a kid who is behind gets further and further behind. While we're waiting, hoping that they catch up on their own, which I do not understand. They don't catch up on their own. They get further and further behind. It's imperative that we intervene early in the lives of children and that we are very, very intentional. Now, between the three, safety and security, relationships, and language, we have a chance to intervene in all three. We have a chance to have some influence on all three. But the thing about language and reading that we have to recognize is, and I said this to some teachers a while ago and got known for it. I understand that some of your children are hungry and they don't have winter coats and their lives are bad and we all want to do things for them. And that's good. We should do as much as we can. But we should never do things for them like that take away from the time we have to teach them to read and give them knowledge and give them academic success. And the reason is there are other ways for them to get a coat. There are other places they can get those other things. But if you spend your valuable, if you subtract from your valuable education time too much to do those other things, there's nobody who's going to replace that time. There's no place else they're going to go. In many cases, these kids, their one good chance to learn to read and write is you. Their one good chance to learn and read and write is school. There's lots of places they can get food. There's lots of places they can get coats. There's lots of places they can get other things. This is probably the only place that they're going to be able to learn to read. So it's imperative that we don't do that. And of course, the goal of everything is that you will reach a point in adolescence when you can look into your future and believe, based on your past, that you don't know what's coming next, but you're reasonably confident that your future will be bright. If you can do that, you've got resilience. If you believe in that, you're going to have some resilience. You're going to stand up to the sometimes negative experiences in your life. You're going to be able to survive against the occasional hurricane. And that leads to that great question about what you want to be when you grow up. So what about technology and social media? What impact does this have on things? So there's an increasing body of evidence. So let me say something about teen suicide and suicide attempts. Kids are way less likely to kill themselves than older people. They're way more likely to make suicidal gestures and attempts that are non-lethal. So we have lots of attempts and we have very few successes. But because we don't have that many kids who kill themselves, the statistics on that they fluctuate. In any given community or in any given school, they can go up and down dramatically. You could have 3 kids in a community kill themselves in a short period of time, and then nobody for a year and a half, then 2 more. And it looks like a trend. It looks like there's a cause. It's just random variation. But as we look at this over time, and we look at this around the country, there does seem to be a significant increase in both successful suicides by young kids and serious suicide attempts by young kids. That is, attempts which require medical hospitalization to help them recover from the effects of their suicide attempt. And if you look at the timing of this, it's very difficult to conclude that the meteoric rise of social media doesn't have something to do with it. That this is not in some way challenging or undermining or making more complex that foundational relationship aspect of human development. We are evolved to have relatively deep, significant personal relationships face to face with a relatively few people. 2 people, 5 people, 10 people, 25 people, 30 people. The upper limit of people you can actually know in a significant social sense is probably about 150. But you can have 500, you can have 800 friends on Facebook. You can have thousands of followers on Twitter and Instagram. And for kids who don't have years and years and years of experience with the evolved basis of direct, personal, close relationship, the way they're being exposed now and experiencing this multitude of very shallow relationships instead of a very few number of very deep relationships, really close relationships with kids in the neighborhood. They have lots and lots of shallow relationships with people who I would say they don't really even know. That's a different model of relationships than we are evolved for. That's different than what our brains are wired for. And there are consequences for that. And I think one of the consequences is that a small number of kids, social media is a wonderful thing for a lot of people and a lot of kids if things are going well. But if things start to go badly, social media can become a tremendous burden on kids. And I think we have to watch it closely. One of the things I advise parents, and this is something I remember that went really, really well, I was talking to a mother about her daughter. Her daughter was 12 years old. She had had some very unhealthy experiences on social media. Her mother was very concerned about it. And the mother said very openly, I really wish she wouldn't do it at all, but I don't think that's realistic. I said, so what can we do then? And we talked about it and we agreed, all of us, that the daughter would still be on social media, but her mother would be next to her whenever she could while she was doing it. So the mother would get a window on this kid's social media experience. She would see what she says, what her friends say. She would get to know them. You know, when your children were having friends and play dates and kids were coming over the house and they were coming over live in person, you got to listen in. You got to watch from the next room. You got to listen from the next room. You heard what was going on. You got to know those kids a little bit. You got to understand those kids a little bit. You got enough of a sample of what's going on that you could be more helpful and more guiding to your child. When these things are going on in social media and you don't see it, you don't know it, you don't know what's going on, how do you have any sense of what this part of their life is like? They're in it alone. They're in it without adult guidance, and we're not evolved for that kind of emotional, interpersonal social interaction. We're just not. We don't know what it means yet. We're adapting the things that have changed so fast. I think our kids are certainly are paying the price for it. Now, some people will react to that and say that for traumatized, stressed kids, we should take their social media away. That can be catastrophic. We had a young man, 13 years old, a few years ago, who was going through a tremendous number of things. He was living in a group home, and they took his iPad away from him. His iPad was how he stayed connected to his friends at school, because he wasn't going to the same school anymore. It's the only way he stayed connected to them. That's not the reason he killed himself, but it was certainly a contributing factor. And we wonder to this day, if they had, we didn't know they had done that. If they had not done that, would he have survived? Their motivation for doing it was they wanted him to be paying attention to the world around him, to the friends he could make there, to the friends at his new school, all good motivations, but they were taking away the social relationships he had. As unhealthy as we thought they were all he had. Those were all of his friends, and they took away all of his friends. The other thing that you have to understand, particularly as kids get to be adolescent, I was sitting with a girl one time. She commented to her mother. Her mother said, well, if something goes wrong on social media, you're not on Facebook, what's the worst thing that could happen? And the girl shot back, I could lose all my friends. And her mother said, you can't lose all your friends. And I interjected and said, yes, you can. It's one of the things that happens in social media is you can lose all or nearly all your friends in an afternoon if things go really badly for you. That's never been true before. You know, your whole set of friendships and relationships could never be burned to the ground that quickly. They can be now. They can be. We're not wired for that. We're not evolved for that. It's part of a rapidly changing world that we're struggling to adjust to. The knowledge gap. You know, there's the book out now, The Knowledge Gap, but the knowledge gap has been something people have tried to talk about for a long time. You got to know stuff to know stuff. It's sort of the economics of knowledge, the economics of learning. It's very much like the economics of money and business. You know, you got to have money to make money. You got to know stuff to learn stuff. You got to know enough stuff that you can know more stuff. The more stuff you learn, the easier it is to know more stuff. The more stuff you've learned, the easier it is to learn stuff. We all want kids to be able to learn as much stuff on their own as independently as possible. But in the beginning, we have to feed them and guide them to the right things so that they're better prepared to learn about things later. We can't wait. We all want them to be able to learn things on their own, but in the beginning, we're gonna have to feed them things and guide them and sort of lead them to the trough so that they pick up as much as is humanly possible. Learning stuff, you have to learn stuff in order to be able to learn stuff. And some kids just don't know as many things. There's a knowledge gap. And particularly around what we would consider more classic academic knowledge, there are kids who that gap continues to affect them. And like the other gaps, it tends to get wider over time unless we intervene. And the best time to intervene, obviously, is early. Trauma also affects the knowledge gap in the sense that if you are traumatized, your brain is less sponge-like. It is picking up fewer things from the world. It's picking up other things, but they're not things that contribute to your body of knowledge. If your mind is using too much of its resources to scan your environment, to be vigilant, to be careful about sitting at the best place in the room and the best place in the bus, so that in case something bad goes on, you'll be ready, you'll be safe, then it's not using that time and resources in a relaxed way to gather other knowledge. Really interesting question to ask kids who ride a school bus who are stressed and traumatized. Where's the best place to sit in the bus? And there are two answers. And every kid knows them. It's either better to sit in the front in case something happens, you can get off quickly, or it's best to sit in the back so if anything happens, it's in front of you and you can see it coming. The worst place to sit on the bus, and every kid knows it, is in the middle. If you have a traumatized background, is in the middle, because stuff can happen behind you that you don't see coming, and you're too far from the door to get off, and you're too far from the driver who might otherwise protect you. Different kids will give slightly different answers, but for kids who are stressed and traumatized, those answers make all the sense in the world. Social justice and the need for purpose. Fighting for social justice, arguing for social justice, being adamant and passionate about social justice for kids can give them a sense of purpose, and a sense of purpose that's close to their life. A sense that they're making their world, they're remaking their world and making it a better place. That's the kind of thing you can look back on later and believe deeply that you have a future. Look at what I did. Look at the bigger causes I fought for. Look at the fact that I thought of other people and not just myself, that I would contribute to my society. Those things are important. And right now, and hopefully for the continuing future, the notions of social justice, of anti-racism, of all those movements are coming together in a way that give us an opportunity to help kids develop this sense of purpose. Everybody needs a sense of purpose. People need a sense of purpose. They need a reason to get up. They need a reason to move forward. They need a sense that they're moving towards something and not just treading water. Nobody goes to the pool and says, I'm going to go tread water. They say, I'm going to go swimming. I'm going to move. I'm going to go. I'm going to cover some distance. You need a sense of purpose. Treading water would be a perfectly wonderful exercise. Nobody says that. They swim. They want to move. We need that sense of purpose. And kids who doubt their sense of purpose because of what's going on in their life need that even more. Need that even more. And this pervades everybody across. I'll venture into a different field of mental health. One of the things I do in my regular day job is work with a program in Milwaukee County that supports young people in the first 2 to 4 years of psychosis, typically schizophrenia. I have a great story about a young man who was spending most of his time in his mother's basement. He had a very difficult life even before he succumbed to psychosis. He had become very, very ill. And when we met him, he was spending all of his time in his mother's basement, sitting on an old couch, chain smoking. He was hearing a lot of voices, had a lot of delusions, wasn't on medicine. We got him out. Slowly but surely, we got him out of his mother's basement. We got him moving. We got him doing some things, contributing to his family. He got a job. He got on medicine. The medicine was helpful to him. And he was doing, 9 months later, it was like he wasn't even the same person. He was doing so much better. And he came in to see a psychiatrist, and his team was with him. And they said, "Doc, you're going to just love seeing him. It's just amazing how good Robert's doing." And the doctor was so excited because he knew what he looked like, just 6 to 9 months earlier. "Robert, it's so good to see you. You're doing so well. Tell me how it's going." "It's going great, Doc. I can't believe how well I'm doing." He had insight into his illness. He was doing so well. He says, "Really, tell me, like the voices, the hallucinations, how are they?" He says, "Oh, same as they've always been. No better, no worse. Just exactly the same. I'm hearing voices all the time. I'm hearing voices right now." The doctor was surprised. He said, "But you're doing so well. How can you be hearing voices?" He says, "Well, I still hear the voices. Like, I got a job I got to go to. I don't have time for that shit." The fact that he had some purpose in his life let him take this ongoing, stressful, really traumatic experience of hallucinating and put it in a completely different perspective. And let him minimize it, instead of making a mountain out of a molehill, it let him make a molehill out of a mountain. Hallucinating is a really bad experience, but because he had these other things going on in his life, he had this sense of purpose. I have a job, they expect me, they need me. I need to be there, they're counting on me. It gave him a sense of purpose in his life that let him take these hallucinations, which by his own report were no better than they had ever been, and put them in an entirely different perspective. The same thing that happens for kids with trauma. When they get a sense of purpose, and social justice contributes to that, when they get a sense of purpose, it puts their trauma in a different place, in a different perspective. A unique place for language reading. It's an antidote for everything that's bad. It facilitates relationships, facilitates coping. We cope, think about this, coping is a thought process. We think in words. The more words you have, the better your brain is with words, the more able you will be to think things through and to cope with things successfully in a language-based way. Therapy is done in words. Self-talk is done in words. Mindfulness requires some facility with words. You're more equipped to handle everything if you've got more words and you're better with words. The world is less confusing to you when you understand the words that are around you. When you're constantly hearing words, seeing words, and encountering words, and you're not sure what they mean, or you think you know what they mean, but you're not confident that you're right, that's enormously stressful. So my nephew, for his junior year of high school, spent a year abroad in Mexico. He was a very good student in Spanish, and his teachers certainly approved of him going to Mexico. What you find out when you get there is you can't really speak Spanish. You suck. You're terrible at speaking Spanish. For the first 6, 7, 8 weeks, he was sad, he was depressed, he was downtrodden, he was stressed, he wasn't sleeping well, because he couldn't understand most of what was going on around him. Now, fortunately, because of his life and his resolve, he was able to last through that, to survive that, until he could come out the other side. But it's like that for some people, even in their native language. They don't understand language well enough, they don't understand words well enough. They're constantly surrounded by people and places and conversations that they can't be absolutely sure that they're understanding what's being communicated to them. They feel like they're faking it all the time. And the best opportunity to keep that from happening is by giving kids lots and lots and lots and lots of language early on. exposing them to as much language, as much oral language, and as much written language as we possibly can. You know, it reorganizes the brain, obviously, in desirable ways. And it's within our control. We can do something about it. The infrastructure already exists. Therapy, therapists, and therapeutics. This is an interesting conversation to have in the light of the recent COVID shutdowns and the pandemics and the way schools have been closed all over the country. People who did not think of themselves as teachers were flung into the role of teachers, at least tutors, at least teachers' aides. Parents and others found themselves more closely and intimately involved in their children's learning and in the teaching of their children than they were just the day before. Teachers had to figure out not only how to teach remotely, but how to use their remote teaching to support the face-to-face people who were there as the immediate face-to-face resource. Those parents and others did not become teachers, but they did teach. Doesn't make them a teacher. You have to do more to be a teacher than just teach. Everybody teaches. That doesn't mean everybody's a teacher. It means we do some teaching. But teacher is a special title for people who have made this a profession, who've taken this seriously, who've studied it and refined it and tried to get better at it. None of you can be therapists. None of you, I mean, unless you have some training I don't know about, none of you are going to be therapists, but you can all be therapeutic. You can all learn some things that therapists do, that I do, that other people do, to make some of your interactions a little bit more valuable, a little bit more helpful. And understanding why those things are good gives you an additional window and understanding on development and psychosocial stress and psychosocial trauma and mental well-being, because you can see it through a different lens. You see it in a different detail and from a different angle. This is much like when you learn the science of reading and you learn the depth of phonemic awareness and phonology and phonics and morphology and orthography, and you learn all these things, you learn about linguistics and brain development, so that you can really understand what's happening in front of you, that when a child is struggling to read a certain thing, you really deeply understand immediately, innately, what's going on, and you know what to do. Having a little bit of that gives you a deeper insight into what you're doing. And the same thing with therapists and being therapeutic. So who are the therapists? Who needs to be therapeutic? Everybody all the time. Even if I see a child twice a week for an hour each time, which would be a lot, twice a week for an hour each time to help them cope with their trauma, people would say they get their therapy every Monday and Wednesday with Dr. Dykstra at 3 o'clock. That's just a fraction of the therapy they get. Most of the therapy they get from their friends, they get from their family, they get from their teachers, they get from their world, they get from their environment. They get an intense dose of hopefully highly skilled and beneficial therapy during those 2 hours a week, which would be a lot. But the lower intensity, more informal therapy they're getting all the time still adds up to more. It still adds up to more. There's no way that isn't still going to be most of what helps kids recover from trauma and develop their sense of themselves in the world. All of you are being therapeutic and doing therapy to one degree or another with kids all the time. And one of the advantages of seeing it that way is the difference between 60-minute therapy and 60-second therapy. You know, if I or some licensed therapist want some kid to come see me, because of the way that system is set up, because of the hassle of stopping what we're doing and getting the kid in the car and driving them to the appointment and showing up, my hassle of having to bill an insurance company, or somebody would bill an insurance company on my behalf, there's no way we're going to do that, schedule that for less than an hour. It just isn't worth it. But I'll let you in a little secret. In a 45 or 50-minute therapy session, like 5 or 6 minutes of it are therapy, and the rest of it is this relationship dance that goes on around the therapy, where we try to create a moment and then take advantage of that moment. The advantage of being more of an in-the-moment ad hoc therapist like you are, like I am, like everybody is, so we don't have to spend 40 out of 45 minutes creating the moment and then 5 minutes taking advantage of that moment, we can just be there and wait for the moment to arrive. Because 60 minutes, 60 seconds of therapy with a kid at a certain moment, right at the right moment, can be way more effective than 60 minutes of therapy that I've pre-scheduled for Thursday afternoon. You know, you can be much more effective and beneficial to a kid in the minutes after they were bullied than I can be with them 3 days later when they try to tell me about being bullied. It's a very different kind of help. It's a very different opportunity to help. And the most effective any of us can be is if we're doing both of those and those things fit together. So it's not the length of time, but it's the opportunity, the ripeness of the moment, if you would. And you all know that. It's the same way with education. If you're teaching a kid, if you're trying to teach a kid something in social studies, and they're not into it at the moment, there's only so much that's going to take. But if they're into it, if they're excited about it, if it's something they can relate to, if it's something they can relate back to their life, if they already knew something about it and it's interesting to them, it's amazing how much they can learn in a short period of time. It's the same thing with therapy and trying to help people. And my expertise as a therapist at an appointed time is not nearly as you just being good enough. Just being good enough in the moment, being there at the right moment. Think of it as first aid. You know, who's the best, if you're in a car accident and you stumble out of the car and you're bleeding profusely and your leg is in bad shape, who's the best person to help you? The answer is the next person to come along. You hope this person is a surgeon or a paramedic or an EMT, but really the best person to help you is whoever is the next person to come along, because they're there. I do photography, and one of the questions of photography is, what's the best lens for any given picture? What's the best camera for any given picture? The answer is whatever you have with you. The same thing with helping each other. We should never be afraid to offer some comforting words, to take a little step towards being therapeutic with kids, because we think it's somebody else's job or that's best left for their appointment on Thursday afternoon. If you're the one who's there and the opportunity is there and you sense that opportunity as a human being, you should take that opportunity. And that goes back to this question of timing and who's there. And it's important that we have strong relationships and that kids improve through relationships. One of the things that we understand about therapy is the two things that predict effective therapy have nothing to do with the technical skill of the therapist. It's how strongly and how devotedly and how convincingly they form a relationship with somebody and how much they reflect on what they do so that they can get better at it. I think it's the same thing for you or for anybody else. If you form a relationship with another human being, that relationship is good with them. And if you take a few minutes now and then to reflect on how you could make that relationship stronger and better and more effective, that'll make you even more effective. So some warnings about getting close to kids who've been traumatized and are going through stress. And as teachers, you all know this already. You will be changed by this. You already have been. There is no way to work with these sort of situations to encounter the kind of kids that you encounter, that I encounter, to not be changed by it. And some of those changes may not be good. It may not always change you for the better. You may become more irritable for a time. You and people around you may pay a price. You have to take care of yourself to ameliorate that. If you want to get close, if you want to work with kids who are struggling to read, you're going to have to accept a lot of struggle and a lot of failure and a lot of pain and coming face to face with a lot of trauma. And you have to be able to do that and to remain emotionally stable on your feet, doing whatever you need to do so that you can be as effective as possible. And you have to understand you will never be able to do enough, not even close. You will simply never be able to do enough, but you will do so much. You cannot snatch them all up. You know, I'm past this now, but the days that I would meet kids and think seriously about taking them home and making them part of my family. You'll never be able to do that. You can't do that. You just have to accept there are limits on the benefit you can provide to people. All of that has to be okay. It has to be okay that we put ourselves at risk. It has to be okay that we can't do everything, that we can't save every kid. We don't have to save them. We have to make things better. We have to contribute. We have to make things a little bit better. We can't lament what we can't do for children. We have to focus on what we can do and do it as well as possible. We have to engage in self-care. Sometimes you have to turn off the phone, stop checking the email, stop thinking about things, get some exercise, listen to some music, do a puzzle, eat some good food. Perfection at this is not an option. It's not even a goal. You can't be perfect. You know, you're gonna wish you had said something different. You're gonna wish you had learned something earlier. You're gonna wish you had known that then. You know, I look back on kids I worked with years ago and think if I knew then what I knew now, I would have been so much more helpful to them. You have to get over that. Within your own mind and spirit, the one and only thing you have to be trying to do when you're working with children is help their life be better for them. Not help them be better for you or anybody else, but help their life be better for them. You have to want nothing from them. To want nothing from them. To the depth of your soul, you have to want nothing from them. And in some way, you have to be open and at peace with what you're going to confront and what's going to come up. You have to be ready that you could hear anything at any moment. You just don't know. When you're open to these kids, there's no telling what they're going to tell you. There's no telling what you're going to find out. And you have to be ready that can happen at any moment. And you have to have what I refer to as a healthy arrogance. That is, I don't know how I'm going to be helpful to this kid, but I know I'm going to be helpful. I just believe it. I just believe that in some way, however small, they're going to be better off meeting me than not meeting me. You have to believe that in some way, somehow, that kid is better off being in your class than not being in your class. Even if you can't do everything for them you want, you believe that them being with you and getting to know you and you getting to know them is going to be good for them in the long run. You have to absolutely believe that. You have to practice these things. You have to know how to go there when you need it. You have to know how to calm yourself and be able to not overreact. I think most of the people on this meeting are probably women. So I'm going to speak to you. You have to learn not to do what is a little more common in women than in men. That is, you hear a heart-wrenching story from a child and you cover your mouth and you get teary-eyed and you get upset. And, oh, baby, come here, let me give you a hug. You have to not have those big reactions. These kids don't need those big reactions. You have to stay cool. You have to stay calm. You have to stay in your right mind. You have to give them the impression that it's all going to be all right. Some tricks and techniques. Go slow. Talk slowly. Be patient. Pause. Search for exactly the right word you're looking for. It gives people a sense that you're invested in them and engaged with them. It slows you down. It slows them down. I start a lot of questions with the phrase, I wonder. I wonder what would have happened if you had done that differently. I wonder what he was thinking when he said that to you. Asking kids what went wrong. You know, the difference between asking why you did something versus, hey man, what went wrong? How did that happen? Once you answer my question, what went wrong, you have accepted what I call the sneaky premise. You accepted this was not what you wanted. When I ask you, why did you do that? It implies that this all went the way you planned for, that you had a reason to do this and you wanted it to be this way. That's not very compassionate. So we need to ask kids questions in compassionate ways, ways that don't feel like they're accusing them of things. I'm moving very, very quickly because we're very low on time. Keep your energy, intensity, and emotion in check, dialed down, backed off. Working with a child side by side is very different than working face to face. It's very alarming in stressful moments to have somebody looking you in the face. Sitting right side by side, maybe looking in the same direction, having a conversation as though we're sitting on a couch next to each other, driving in a car next to each other, is much less intimate, is much less threatening, is much more approachable. Try not to stare these kids in the face or to force eye contact. I've seen people lift kids' head up and say, look me in the eye when we talk to each other. No, don't. Don't look people in the eye when they talk to you. Don't exaggerate that. And less is more. Fewer words, less emotion, slower pace, more time, more patience. Less is more. And don't feel like you need to rush in with a solution. Oftentimes there isn't a solution. It's very unlikely that your solution isn't something people have tried or considered that hasn't failed before. You don't need to solve things. People need to be understood. Mostly they need to understand things themselves better than when they started out. Resist the urge to come in with a solution. You're going to help them tell their story to you, not tell somebody else's story. We really want them to hear their story. And when we ask kids about things that have happened, I don't know why is usually the honest answer. Why did you do that? I don't know. I don't know why I did it. I don't know. It must be really hard that these things keep happening. We can't figure out why they happen. Play Columbo. For those of you who remember Columbo, don't act like you know everything or you have all the answers. Go slow, be patient, ask for help. I'm trying to understand. I wonder, could you help me out? And the power of the unexpected. You know, when a kid is in trouble and has done something wrong and they're expecting you to yell at them and land on them hard, if the next words out of your mouth are kind or comforting or patient or quiet, if it's about something other than what, I've gone to schools where kids have threatened to kill people, and I ask them a lot of questions before I get to that. And it's comforting to them because they're expecting me to jump right in. What's the matter with you? Why did you do this? When I don't, it's powerful, it's therapeutic, and it helps build a relationship. But all that takes time. There's always, always, always gentleness, love, and kindness are never the bad idea. Being gentle, loving, and kind, and being very deliberate about that is never a bad idea. And realize that our kids and their families are afraid. They're afraid a lot of the time. So be careful not to do things which may provoke their fear. Talking too fast, talking too loud, moving too fast, getting too close, being too abrupt, being too sudden will tend to provoke people's fear if that's how they're wired. So practice being slow, being calm, being quiet, being patient, being gentle, loving, and kind. And understanding that everything is personal. This is very personal. If you work with kids, it's personal. It's always personal. So take care of yourself. Don't deny that it's personal. You don't have to say it to them because the word is very intimidating and powerful, but know in your head that it's okay to love these children. It's absolutely okay to love them and care about them. You will gain more than it costs you, but it will cost you considerably. To love that many people that devotedly is an extraordinary experience. Does anybody have any particular questions?
Steve, this is Earl here. One of the things as a former coach, administrator, one of the things I learned is I never said, I understand, because unless you walked in their shoes,
right,
you don't understand. So
right.
That was a lesson that I learned a long time ago.
And I think that's right. I think that's right. I think the urge to say, I get it, I understand. There's too much chance that you don't. And the person isn't going to believe you even if you do. So to be quiet, to be humble, it's probably a word I could have used in the presentation, to be humble about it. To leave a kid who's got repeated problems and to say, you know, I think we're both trying to understand each other. I think I'm going to keep trying to get you and understand you. And I hope you can help me with that. I want to understand what's going on, because I think if I understand, I might be a little bit more helpful. In the course of learning to understand them, they understand themselves. One of the things we have to remember is when kids answer these questions for us, when they answer questions for us, we hear their answer, they hear their answer too. They hear their own voice saying, I don't know, I was just angry. I'm not sure, I don't know what to do anymore. I just feel so bad all the time. They hear themselves say that, and that's important because now they're understanding better what's going on. It's not just that we don't understand, oftentimes they don't understand. We're saying we understand, and the kid's sitting there thinking, I don't even understand. How can you understand? Any more questions or comments? I hope this was helpful to people in some way. I hope there was little nuggets. You know, the poet said that I can teach you nothing except that which is already moving within your own soul. And I really believe that if there's just one or two things, just a little bit today that is moving within your soul, that I was able to pull forward for you and shine a light on and help you to see it and understand it, and to make it more conscious and more manifest, then I am honored to have had a part of that. If there's anything I can do for you or your districts, if there's any way I can be of help to you, I don't hesitate to reach out and contact me. And if I can be helpful, I'll do as much as I can. And even if it's a little bit, it's something. So take care, be well, be safe, continue to keep your social distance, and know that I have the deepest respect for everything you do and why and how you do it. And even if we disagree a little bit on the teaching of reading and the specifics, I think we're going to come around on that. We're going to get those things solved. We're going to find the humility to correct some things we could have done better. We're going to find the peace of mind to recognize that that's a human experience, to get better at things. And it's going to serve all of our children much better, which can only be a good thing. And in the end, it does come down to social justice. So keep the faith, and I wish I could be there with all of you. Thank you all so much.
Steve,
Thank
I don't
you.
know if you can see it, but there's an outpouring in the chat.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I see that. I see that.
Thank you so very much.
I
And as one of,
appreciate letting me see that as that comes in. That's
yeah,
one of the things when you do these presentations live is you look out and you make eye contact with people, and you get some sense of how it's being received, and you kind of moderate your energy as you do it. It's really weird to like stare into a camera lens for like 2 hours straight and vaguely see your own curved reflection looking back at you. It's kind of a strange experience, but I'm trying to get better at it. I really appreciate what all of you do. Remember, first and foremost, above all things, it is never wrong to love, to be kind, to be generous. It is never a mistake. If you're not sure what else to do, be kind. Just be kind.
thank you so much. As somebody in the chat box said, this was extremely powerful. So thank you so very much. We really appreciate it.
I'm glad. I'm honored. Thank you all so much.
Absolutely. We were glad to spend the day with you,
Yes.
even if it was remotely. So thank
It's
you.
okay. Well, you wouldn't have all fit in my living room. So we couldn't have packed you in, and it would have been a violation of the COVID rules for sure. 80
Absolutely.
or 90 people packed into my moderately sized living room.
All right, so just a few announcements and we'll have a few minutes to yourself. The Improving Literacy Partnership Grants were given a no-cost extension due to COVID through 9/30/2021. Information about the annual reporting will go to the PIs. Reminder that there's a website, a Twitter handle, and be looking for a evaluation that will be sent by Amy Hawley. And I'll see many of you at 3 o'clock at Dean's Compact. So for the rest of you, have a great day, and we'll have a great day at Dean's Compact starting at 3 o'clock. So thank you all again for participating. Have a lovely evening. Bye.